Tonight, we travel back in time, to a world that once existed and now only whispers. In the next hours, you will move through a late Bronze Age world that once felt eternal to the people living inside it, a world of palaces and ports, of scribes and storerooms, of fragile trade routes carrying metal and grain across dangerous distances, and of rituals that promised balance even as unseen stress gathered beneath the surface. This is not a story built from legend or romance, but from the surviving traces of real places and real lives, burned layers in cities that never rose again, archives that suddenly fall silent, and the slow shift from a connected international order into smaller, harder communities learning to endure without the old guarantees. You will hear the creak of ships and the hush of abandoned roads, the pressure of hunger, the shock of fire, and the uneasy transformation of survival itself, as the world that depended on bronze begins to fracture into something new. So settle in, let the shadows gather gently at the edge of your thoughts, and follow the echoes carefully, because the past rarely announces its ending, it simply changes the rules while people are still trying to live by the old ones. The world that stretched around the eastern Mediterranean was not experienced as a fragile construction balanced on luck, but as an inherited order so familiar and so old that most people could no more imagine it ending than they could imagine the sea deciding to stop being salt. Across coasts and river valleys, along mountain passes and through dry interior plains, life moved inside rhythms that felt dependable because they had repeated for generations, and repetition can trick even the cautious mind into mistaking habit for permanence. This order was held together by bronze, not only as a material, but as an agreement written into geography, because bronze required copper and tin rarely lay together in the earth, meaning that power depended on distance, and distance depended on trust, and trust depended on the continued ability of people to move goods across dangerous spaces without the whole chain snapping. Copper could be pulled from mines and mountain veins, sometimes from islands whose hills were scarred by extraction, while tin often arrived from farther away, carried along routes that crossed rugged terrain and uncertain borders, and once these two metals met in fire they became the edge of the plow that fed the village, the head of the axe that built the roof, and the blade of the spear that decided who could command and who must obey. Because no kingdom possessed everything it needed, even the most fortified palace relied on the outside world in ways that were easy to forget during calm seasons, because forgetting dependence is what people do when dependence has lasted long enough to feel normal. A ruler could sit beneath painted beams and carved stone, surrounded by storerooms heavy with grain and oil, and still be vulnerable to a missed shipment, a disrupted road, a storm-lost cargo, or a distant political rupture that would arrive not as a messenger announcing disaster, but as an absence where something was expected. Ships moved along established routes with hulls weighted by copper ingots shaped like stretched hides, with jars of oil sealed tight against spoilage, with wine, timber, textiles, and small luxuries that proved a court's reach extended beyond its own horizon, and the sea carried all of it with the cold indifference of an element that can support life one day and swallow it the next. Caravans followed inland paths that had been walked so many times that they felt like part of the land itself, winding through Anatolia and the Levant, stopping at wells and fortified towns, moving according to the slow mathematics of animals, water, and risk, because every mile of land travel was an argument between profit and survival. This was a world that functioned through communication as much as through force, because power was not only the ability to fight, but the ability to coordinate, to send instructions, to receive tribute, to resolve disputes, and to keep multiple regions behaving as if they were part of a single frame. Letters traveled between courts, carried by messengers who trusted roads, gates, and the fragile safety of hospitality, and kings addressed one another with formal language that called rivals brothers, not because sentiment ruled politics, but because ceremony could soften hostility long enough for exchange to continue. Gift exchange was not decoration but infrastructure, because gifts were proof of connection, and connection was the bloodstream of the age, carrying metals, grain, prestige, and obligation in patterns that seemed as natural as weather. Gold, lapis lazuli, finely worked weapons, chariots that gleamed with costly fittings, and royal brides moved between dynasties, and each exchange reinforced the sense that the world was held together by something more than mere chance, by an invisible lattice of promises that rulers believed they could maintain through ritual language and careful balance. As long as these exchanges continued, order felt assured, because when systems function, they create the illusion that their functioning is a law of nature rather than the result of constant human maintenance. Cities in this age were not chaotic piles of houses, but carefully managed centers designed to extract, store, and redistribute resources, with palaces that acted like administrative hearts and temples that tied the success of the state to divine favor, demanding festivals, offerings, and obedience in return for the promise of stability. The palace storeroom was both wealth and vulnerability, because grain piled in one place can feed armies and workers, yet it can also become a target, and it can also vanish quickly when the flow of harvest and tribute weakens. Writing served this system, and in many places it served it almost exclusively, because literacy was not spread broadly as a tool of personal expression, but concentrated among scribes who turned the living complexity of human labor into lists, quotas, and schedules that could be enforced. A harvest became a number, a workforce became a roster, an obligation became a line pressed into clay, and the act of recording was less about honoring the past than about managing the present with enough precision that a small group of officials could control a large population. Most people never saw the full extent of the network that shaped their lives, because a farmer might spend his whole existence within sight of familiar hills, and a potter might never travel beyond the nearest market town, yet their daily survival still depended on decisions made far away, in stone halls where rulers interpreted omens, weighed alliances, and assumed that the structure supporting them would endure. A sailor might understand the system through winds and currents, through the uneasy familiarity of foreign harbors, through the way languages changed from one coastline to the next, and through the fact that profit was always braided tightly with danger, because the sea rewards confidence and punishes it with the same indifferent hand. The strength of this world lay in its connectivity, but connectivity can hide fragility the way a brightly painted wall can hide rot in the beams behind it, because a tightly connected system has many advantages and one terrible weakness, which is that failure can travel along the same routes that once carried prosperity. Surpluses were calculated, not infinite, margins were thinner than the palace imagery suggested, and efficiency left little room for prolonged disruption, even though those at the top often mistook the smooth running of administration for proof that the administration could not fail. The late Bronze Age world had faced wars before, and it remembered them as disturbances that could be resolved through victory, treaties, tribute, or dynastic change, which meant that each crisis that passed reinforced the belief that order, once shaken, would always be restored. Religion strengthened this confidence, because ritual calendars promised renewal through repetition, and disasters were interpreted as divine displeasure that could be corrected through sacrifice, prayer, and renewed obedience, as if the cosmos itself favored hierarchy and stability. Within this worldview, collapse was imagined as local and temporary, never total, because total collapse was too vast to fit inside ordinary expectations, and because people rarely imagine the end of the systems that have shaped their entire sense of reality. Even the possibility that the whole web might tear at once had little space to grow, because the daily evidence of ships arriving, storerooms filling, letters traveling, and rituals continuing felt like proof that the world was still itself. Yet beneath the appearance of order, stress can accumulate quietly, unseen and unmeasured, because the factors that weaken a complex system often arrive not as a single dramatic blow, but as many smaller pressures that overlap until the structure is carrying more weight than it was ever designed to hold. A poor harvest does not always cause immediate collapse, but it can force harsher collection, and harsher collection can breed resentment, and resentment can weaken compliance, and weakened compliance can disrupt production, and disrupted production can reduce surplus further, turning a manageable hardship into a tightening spiral. A missed shipment is not always a catastrophe, yet when many shipments are delayed or lost, the absence becomes heavy, because the palace economy depends on predictable inflow, and predictability becomes harder to sustain when roads are less safe and coastlines are less calm. Banditry grows when people are hungry, and hunger grows when distribution fails, and distribution fails when authority weakens, and authority weakens when it can no longer deliver what it promised, creating a loop where every problem feeds the next. Imagine the atmosphere of a port city that has grown wealthy on exchange, where warehouses smell of oil and resin and salt, where merchants measure weights with practiced suspicion, and where officials watch cargo not only as wealth, but as political oxygen. Now imagine the same port hearing more rumors than news, seeing fewer familiar sails, receiving more anxious messages from inland, and feeling the subtle change in the mood of streets, because a city can sense when its lifeline is becoming uncertain even before the storerooms are empty. Imagine an inland capital that depends on roads threading through rugged terrain, where authority can look immense on clay and stone yet remain delicate on the ground, because documents do not stop raiders and titles do not feed provinces. When provincial communities begin to delay deliveries, not out of ideology but out of desperation, the center is tempted to tighten its demands, yet tightening can snap what remains of loyalty, because a starving household cannot be commanded into abundance. The very tools that made palatial power impressive could also make it brittle, because centralization concentrates surplus, concentrates authority, concentrates responsibility, and when disruption spreads, the concentrated system has fewer alternative paths. A village that has surrendered much of its surplus to a palace in exchange for protection becomes dangerously exposed if the palace fails to return protection, and exposure can turn obedience into anger with frightening speed. In workshops where bronze is cast, the fire that once served creation always waits to become destruction, because charcoal and timber and oil sit close to one another, and because a strained society is a society where accidents increase and sabotage becomes tempting. A smith listens for the tone that tells him the metal has cooled enough to strike, knowing that the difference between a strong blade and a shattered one can be a single careless moment, and in that fine margin you can hear an echo of the wider age, a world relying on precision that cannot be guaranteed forever. Chariots, expensive and gleaming, act like symbols as much as weapons, demanding trained horses, skilled craftsmen, metal fittings, leather, timber, and a reliable supply chain, so that even one vehicle reflects the health of an entire economy. When a ruler displays chariots, he displays not only military readiness but the uninterrupted arrival of materials and the obedience of labor, and when those underlying flows falter, the symbols begin to look like burdens. The sea that connects powers can also become a corridor of fear when movement shifts from trade to flight, because a ship filled with copper promises profit, but a ship filled with families promises desperation, and desperation can be more dangerous than an army because it does not retreat when threatened. On the coasts, watchfires that once signaled familiar arrivals can become warnings, and harbors that once meant safety can become traps, because the same geography that invites exchange also invites invasion. Across the Aegean, fortified palaces watch over plains that depend on careful management of labor and grain, and the collapse of that management means not only political change but hunger, because hunger is what arrives when coordination fails. Across Anatolia, imperial roads stretch outward from administrative centers toward provinces expected to obey and supply, and when obedience falters, the roads carry not only officials but panic, carrying the message that the old assumptions are no longer reliable. Along the Nile, the river continues its ancient cycle, offering the illusion that the cosmos itself remains faithful, yet even a faithful river cannot protect a kingdom if the wider world around it begins to crumble. The most dangerous aspect of this moment is that it does not announce itself as the beginning of an ending, because history rarely speaks clearly to those trapped inside it, and warning signs often look like ordinary problems until they accumulate into something heavier than the world can carry. A border conflict can seem like any other border conflict, a diplomatic insult like any other insult, a failed harvest like any other hardship, until the accumulation begins to feel like a tightening net, and people start making choices that reveal they no longer trust the old guarantees. Some begin to hoard. Some begin to move. Some begin to raid. Some begin to write more urgently, as if urgency could preserve order. And beneath all of it, the web holds for a while longer, because complex systems can appear stable until they suddenly are not, and that apparent stability can be the most deceptive thing of all. So listen to the world while it still turns, while storerooms still smell of oil and grain, while ships still arrive often enough to sustain hope, while scribes still press lists into clay, and while rulers still speak with the confidence of people who have not yet accepted that the air itself is changing. Across the sea lanes and over the mountain roads, power was not maintained by armies alone, but by an ongoing performance of recognition, where rulers confirmed one another's status through gifts, marriages, and carefully shaped words that pretended friendship even when fear was the true foundation beneath it. A king could fortify his walls and sharpen his bronze, yet he still needed copper, tin, timber, grain, horses, skilled craftsmen, and the soft currency of alliances, which meant that survival depended on staying connected to other courts whose interests could shift as quickly as weather over open water. The great palatial world was stitched together by messages that traveled slowly, carried by men who rode and walked through uncertain territory, trusting gatekeepers, local lords, and the fragile safety of hospitality, because a sealed letter was only as secure as the road beneath the messenger's feet. These messages were not casual notes, but instruments of state, written in formal language that followed ritual patterns, so that a request for aid could be wrapped in compliments, a warning could be disguised as concern, and a threat could be delivered as a reminder of brotherhood. When rulers addressed each other as equals, they were not describing reality so much as negotiating it, because equality in language created a temporary platform where bargaining could occur without forcing either side to admit weakness, and in that shared fiction the machinery of diplomacy kept turning. The words brother, friend, and beloved were tools as sharp as blades, because they implied obligation, and obligation could be enforced not only through force but through shame, since a king who failed his brother risked losing face in a world where reputation traveled faster than armies. Gifts moved along the same arteries as raw materials, and the objects themselves carried meanings that were understood without explanation, because a shipment of gold did not simply say wealth, it said access, and access meant that other routes were still open and other partners were still willing. A finely worked weapon could be a promise of mutual defense, a set of horses could be a signal of readiness, and an ornate vessel could be a quiet reminder that luxury exists only where order still holds enough to protect artisans and transport. Marriage was the most intimate form of diplomacy, and therefore the most chilling, because it turned a living person into a treaty that could bleed, grieve, and long for home, while court spoke of the arrangement as if it were merely another exchange of goods. A daughter sent across the sea did not only carry her own story, but carried the expectation that her children would bind dynasties together, and that expectation created a thread that could become a rope if either side chose to pull. Behind every polite phrase lay the awareness that the international order was not a community of trust, but a community of dependency, where each palace needed things it could not produce and therefore could not afford to offend the wrong partner at the wrong time. This dependency created a strange kind of stability, because it rewarded restraint and punished rashness, yet it also created a hidden weakness, because dependency becomes lethal when the flow of goods is interrupted and the only language left is coercion. The scribal rooms where these letters were composed were quiet spaces of immense power, lit by steady lamps and filled with the smell of clay, oil, and inkless labor, because each mark pressed into a tablet could decide whether grain would be shipped, whether troops would march, or whether a border would remain calm for another season. Scribes were trained to write not their own voices, but the voice of the state, and the state's voice had to sound confident even when it was afraid, because fear spoken aloud could invite exploitation by rivals who listened for weakness like wolves listening for injury. A request for grain in a dry year might be phrased as a minor inconvenience, a friendly reminder of past generosity, yet everyone involved understood that hunger is not minor, and that a shortage can unseat officials and ignite unrest faster than any foreign spear. A complaint about bandits on a road might appear as a local annoyance, yet it could signal that central control is thinning, because banditry thrives where authority is distracted, and distraction often begins when resources are strained. Diplomacy in this world was therefore a constant balancing act between reassurance and urgency, between maintaining the appearance of strength and admitting the need for help, and that balance required a shared commitment to the performance, because if one partner stopped playing along, the stage itself could collapse. When a king wrote that he was well and that his land was prosperous, he was not simply sharing news, he was asserting legitimacy, and legitimacy mattered because it shaped whether others would lend support or circle for advantage. The sea, so central to exchange, also imposed its own pace on diplomacy, because storms could delay a message for weeks, and weeks can be the difference between a contained crisis and a runaway collapse, especially when multiple regions are stressed at once. This slowness encouraged formality, because a letter had to be complete, polished, and strategically shaped, since there would be no quick follow-up to clarify a careless phrase, and a careless phrase could become an insult that demanded retaliation. In the courts of great powers, officials tracked the flow of gifts and messages like physicians tracking a pulse, because as long as letters continued to arrive, the world still felt connected, and connection was a kind of proof that order remained. When letters slowed, when shipments became irregular, when promises were delayed, the silence itself became information, because silence in diplomacy is rarely neutral, and a missing message can carry more dread than an angry one. Even the language of equality contained hierarchies, because some courts could afford generosity while others could not, and the ability to give large gifts was itself a form of dominance disguised as kindness. To accept a gift could create debt, and debt could be used later as leverage, so that diplomacy became a slow accumulation of obligations that might one day be called in when circumstances turned harsh. For the people outside palaces, these exchanges were invisible, yet their consequences were not, because a treaty might keep a border peaceful long enough for a harvest to be gathered, and a failed negotiation might mean raids that burned fields before the grain could be stored. A merchant could benefit when rulers agreed to protect routes, and the same merchant could be ruined when protection failed, because the value of goods depends on the predictability of their movement. In this world, the phrase brother could conceal a knife, yet it could also postpone the moment when knives were drawn, and postponement had value because it allowed time for ships to sail, for harvests to be collected, and for officials to keep the machinery of distribution moving. Time itself was a resource exchanged through diplomacy, and when time ran out, everything that had been politely delayed would arrive at once in the form of conflict. As stresses accumulated across the region, the old diplomatic system began to reveal its limits, because the system depended on surplus, and surplus is what drought, war, and disruption consume first. When a king could no longer send the expected gifts, he risked appearing weak, yet sending gifts when the storerooms were thin could deepen domestic strain, creating a trap where the demands of international reputation competed directly with the need to keep one's own people fed. This is where the tone of letters can shift from confident routine to strained insistence, because insistence is what emerges when a person fears they will not be heard, and kings, despite their titles, were still trapped within the same human psychology of insecurity. A ruler might repeat assurances, repeat appeals to friendship, repeat reminders of past loyalty, not because repetition is persuasive in itself, but because repetition is what a threatened mind does when it needs to believe that words can still control reality. At the edges of the system, minor powers watch the great ones carefully, because small states survive by predicting the behavior of larger neighbors, and prediction becomes harder when those neighbors are hungry, distracted, or desperate. A small coastal city might shift allegiance not from betrayal but from survival, because survival requires attaching oneself to whoever can still provide protection, and when protection becomes unreliable, loyalty becomes a luxury. Diplomacy therefore becomes, in the years before collapse, a landscape of fragile calculations, where every decision is haunted by uncertainty, and where the old rules still exist but begin to feel less binding, as if the glue holding agreements together is drying and cracking. The more strained the world becomes, the more tempting it is for rulers to break norms, to seize what they need rather than negotiate for it, and once one breaks norms successfully, others learn that the old restraints are not laws, only habits. Imagine a messenger arriving at a palace gate after weeks on the road, dust on his clothes, eyes wary, holding a sealed tablet that contains not poetry but urgency, because the letter asks for grain, for metal, for troops, or simply for reassurance that an ally still exists. Imagine the moment the seal is broken, the moment the words are read aloud in a cool chamber, and the officials listening realize that the request is not just a request, but a sign that someone else's world is tightening, and that their own world may soon tighten too. In such moments, diplomacy becomes a mirror reflecting the health of the entire system, because each plea, each delay, each carefully worded complaint is an indicator of stress moving through the network like a sickness. The diplomatic world can survive a single crisis, because it can reroute support and renegotiate obligations, yet it struggles when crises overlap, because overlapping crises leave no surplus to trade and no patience to maintain ceremony. When the ceremonial language begins to fail, the failure is subtle at first, appearing as shorter letters, harsher tones, reduced gifts, and more frequent references to danger, because fear presses people toward bluntness. And once bluntness enters a system built on ritual politeness, relationships can deteriorate quickly, because ritual politeness was not decoration, it was the buffer that prevented every conflict from becoming immediate violence. So the letters and gifts that once seemed like proof of stability can become, in hindsight, proof of fragility, because they reveal how much work it took to keep the world feeling whole, and how quickly that feeling could unravel when the work could no longer be sustained. The international order endures, right up until it does not, and when it fails, the silence that follows is not only the silence of burned cities, but the silence of unanswered messages, of couriers who never return, and of kings who stop calling one another brother because the word no longer has any power. A system can feel strongest precisely when it has become most dependent on itself, because the very efficiency that makes it powerful also removes the slack that would otherwise soften shocks, and the Bronze Age web of palaces, ports, caravans, and courtly promises had been tightened for generations until it hummed with connection, while hiding how little strain it could truly endure. The first tear rarely announces itself as the first, because people interpret disruption through the language they already know, and a delayed shipment, a rude diplomatic reply, or a season of thin harvest can be explained away as misfortune, as local incompetence, or as the gods' temporary displeasure, rather than as a warning that the entire structure is beginning to fail. What changes before anything burns is the feeling of predictability, the subtle sense that the world is still following the old timetable, because once predictability weakens, every decision becomes heavier and every rumor becomes more believable. Along the trade routes, absence becomes an event that no one dares to name, because a harbor master who is used to counting hulls and listening for familiar languages begins to notice that certain sails do not appear, that certain captains do not return, and that cargoes that once arrived with seasonal certainty now arrive late, light, or not at all. And in a world built on thin margins, a missing cargo is not merely lost profit but missing metal, missing grain, missing oil, and therefore, missing stability. On inland roads, caravans begin to travel in tighter groups with more guards, not because merchants suddenly become paranoid for no reason, but because the landscape itself is changing, as if the hills have learned a new appetite for theft and the spaces between fortified towns have grown longer and darker with each passing month. Banditry is often the first visible symptom of deeper stress, because bandits are not a separate species of human, they are people responding to opportunity and need, and when harvests are poor or taxes are heavy, more hands are willing to risk violence for food. A single ambush can be dismissed as an isolated crime, yet repeated ambushes create a psychological shift, because when movement becomes dangerous, trade becomes slower, and when trade becomes slower, scarcity increases, and scarcity makes violence more attractive, tightening the spiral until even honest travel feels like gambling. Officials can issue decrees against raiders, but decrees require enforcement, and enforcement requires paid guards, and guards require grain, and grain requires harvest, which means that a state already under pressure must spend resources it may not have simply to maintain the illusion that it can still control its own territory. Inside the palaces, the signs of strain appear first as paperwork, because bureaucracy is the language of power, and the first place power registers discomfort. So scribes begin to record more complaints, more shortages, more requests for emergency shipments, more adjustments to rations, and more urgent messages to provincial administrators. And although these tablets are written in formal tones, the density of concern reveals a world that is no longer calm. Storerooms can still look reassuring at a glance, yet the people responsible for counting them sense how quickly fullness can become emptiness when inflow weakens and obligations remain the same, because obligations are stubborn and do not shrink simply because circumstances have. The countryside feels the tightening long before any palace admits it openly, because the countryside is where food is grown and where the pressure of extraction is most direct. So a farmer who once gave a predictable portion of his harvest may now be asked for more, and when asked for more he may give less honestly, hiding grain, moving it at night, lying to the collector, or fleeing entirely, because hunger teaches people to prioritize family over distant authority. Compliance begins to fray not through ideology but through necessity, because a state can demand loyalty, yet it cannot demand that bodies stop needing to eat, and a hungry household will always treat survival as the highest law. When many households begin to conceal surplus, the palace receives less than its ledgers expect, and when the palace receives less it tightens demands, and tightening demands grows resentment, and resentment makes local leaders harder to control, especially when nearby garrisons are underfed, underpaid, or distracted by threats elsewhere, until the system that once looked like a stable pyramid begins to look like a stack of stones balanced on pressure, where each stone stays in place only because the stones beneath it still hold. At the borders, the problems become sharper, because borders are where scarcity turns into movement and movement turns into conflict, so a drought in one region pushes people toward another, and when they arrive they compete for fields, for water, for grazing, for work, and for the right to exist, and competition creates friction that can ignite into violence even without a grand political plan. A small skirmish over pasture can become a feud can become a raid can become a pattern, and once patterns form, fear begins to organize itself, because fear is a form of intelligence when the world becomes dangerous. Rumor becomes a second currency traded as eagerly as copper or grain, because information is protection, and in uncertain times people will pay attention to any whisper that might help them avoid disaster, even if the whisper is wrong. A sailor hears that a port has been attacked and decides to wait, and waiting means cargo sits in warehouses longer, and longer storage means spoilage and loss means higher prices, and higher prices mean anger in the streets that can spill into violence. A shepherd hears that soldiers are being moved and decides to pull his flock away from the road, and that movement changes local markets, which changes the availability of food, which changes the tension between neighbors, because even cautious decisions can reshape a fragile balance. The great powers try to manage instability through the tools they understand, which are diplomacy, redistribution, and force, yet each tool is dulled by the same underlying problem, which is that multiple crises at once consume the surplus those tools require. A request for grain might be answered with a smaller shipment than promised, and the smaller shipment might arrive late, and the late arrival might come after unrest has already begun, meaning that aid becomes too little and too late, and the recipient remembers the failure long after the sender has moved on. A punitive campaign might be launched to punish raiders, yet the campaign drains supplies from already strained storerooms, and soldiers who march hungry do not inspire loyalty, they inspire fear and resentment makes the next crisis worse. The sea that once acted like a shared highway begins to feel less like a highway and more like a boundary, because when ships are attacked or disappear, captains become cautious, and caution slows exchange, and slowing exchange turns prosperous coasts into anxious frontiers. Towns that once welcomed foreign hulls begin to watch the horizon with suspicion, and suspicion changes behavior, because hospitality becomes risky when strangers might be desperate rather than profitable, and desperation can turn a request into a raid within the span of a single night. A harbor that bars its gates to outsiders protects itself for a night, yet it also cuts itself from the flow of goods that keeps it alive, and this is the cruel logic of collapse, because many survival strategies solve immediate danger while deepening long-term fragility. In the palatial centers of the Aegean, centralization has created impressive efficiency, yet it has also created dependence, because villages that once stored their own surplus have been trained to deliver it inward, trusting that the palace will return rations and protection, and when the palace returns too little, the villages experience betrayal and begin to withhold labor, withhold food, and question why they should risk their sons for an authority that seems unable to keep promises. A palace can punish a village in good times, but punishment in bad times is expensive, because it requires troops and logistics require the very surplus that is now disappearing. Across Anatolia, long roads link provincial towns to imperial centers, yet a road is only as strong as the trust that keeps its checkpoints functioning, and if a governor believes the center is weakening, he may begin to keep more resources locally, not from treasonous ambition but from pragmatic caution, because a leader who fails to feed his own region will be removed or killed regardless of his loyalty to distant kings. As provinces become more self-protective, the center receives less support, and receiving less support makes the center weaker, creating a feedback loop where rational caution accelerates systemic failure. In the Levantine ports, archives begin to fill with anxious lines, with requests for timber, with pleas for grain, with warnings about attacks, and with reports that sound increasingly like a world describing its own unraveling, and a letter that says enemies are near may be the truth, yet it may also be a request for reassurance, because the writer is trying to confirm that someone still has the capacity to help. When help does not come, the psychological shock can be as damaging as the physical threat, because a city that believes it is part of an international order can endure hardship with hope, while a city that realizes it is alone begins to behave differently, and loneliness in geopolitics is an invitation to predation. As disruptions overlap, the elite worldview begins to fracture, because elites have built their identity on control, and control is hardest to maintain when nature, scarcity, and human movement refuse to obey. So ritual continues yet begins to feel more urgent, as if sacrifices must be larger, festivals more intense, and prayers more frequent, because when people cannot fix a problem through administration, they turn to the divine with desperation. The gods become not only protectors but explanations, and explanations become necessary when the old assumption of stable order no longer fits what the eye can see in the streets, on the roads, and at the sea's edge. Meanwhile, ordinary people make choices that are small in the moment and immense in the aggregate, because a family that leaves a marginal field and moves toward a river valley adds one more strain to the receiving community. A young man who joins a raiding group adds one more weapon to a landscape already tense. And a town that repairs its wall instead of investing in trade infrastructure makes itself safer for a season while making itself poorer in the long run. These decisions are not coordinated, yet together they create the texture of an age sliding toward fracture, where even cautious actions can amplify fear, and even hopeful actions can be crushed by circumstance. The web does not tear in a straight line, because collapse is not a single wave but a series of surges, with moments where order seems to return and moments where it is ripped away again. So a successful harvest in one region can temporarily ease pressure, allowing trade to resume and letters to regain their formal calm, and for a moment people can persuade themselves that the crisis has passed. Then another drought, another raid, another political dispute, another disruption of shipping, and the calm is revealed as only a pause between shocks. And pauses can be dangerous because they encourage complacency at the very moment the structure is weakening. In a system built on interdependence, every local problem has the potential to become regional, and every regional problem has the potential to become international, because solutions rely on the same networks that are now wobbling. So when one kingdom cannot export grain, another cannot feed its workers. When one island cannot ship copper, another cannot arm its soldiers. And when one port becomes unsafe, the rerouted ships crowd other harbors and stress their supplies, their politics, and their patience. Connectivity, once the age's strength, becomes the channel through which stress spreads, and stress spreads faster than anyone can negotiate it away. The web begins to tear most visibly when the flow of trust slows, because trust is what allows a ship to sail with valuable cargo, what allows a messenger to cross a border, what allows a village to surrender surplus to a palace, and what allows a king to believe that an ally will respond when called. When trust weakens, people hoard, they hesitate, they demand payment up front, they refuse to take risks, and the reduction of risk-taking reduces exchange, and reduced exchange increases scarcity, and scarcity crushes trust further, until the invisible fabric of cooperation can unravel faster than any wall can be rebuilt. Imagine standing on a headland above a familiar harbor and noticing that the water looks the same, the horizon looks the same, the gulls circle as they always have, and yet the mood has changed because fewer ships arrive, and those that arrive bring anxious faces and stories of danger. Imagine the sound of a city at night when watchmen call out more frequently, when gates are barred earlier, when street conversation lowers into whispers, and when the comfort of routine is replaced by the tension of waiting. Imagine the feeling of a letter sealed in clay that asks for aid, and the unbearable interval between sending it and knowing whether anyone will answer, because in that interval a city's fate can slide beyond control, while its people still pretend tomorrow will be ordinary. This is the moment when the Bronze Age world is still recognizable, still functioning enough to feel real, yet already shifting in ways that cannot be reversed easily, because a complex system can absorb shocks only while it retains the confidence to keep moving. Once confidence breaks, movement becomes caution, caution becomes slowdown becomes shortage, and shortage becomes violence, and the web that once connected kingdoms begins to snap strand by strand, quietly at first, and then all at once. A city can survive hardship as long as it believes hardship is temporary, because belief is the invisible mortar that keeps people cooperating when cooperation is inconvenient. Yet when belief begins to fail, the same streets that once carried routine become corridors of suspicion, where every stranger looks like a threat and every shortage feels like the first hint of starvation. In the late Bronze Age world, urban life depended on a delicate choreography of incoming grain, outgoing goods, enforced labor, and the steady confidence that walls, rulers, and gods together could keep the balance intact. And once that choreography stumbled, the cracks did not stay hidden in storerooms or scribal ledgers, but surfaced in public where everyone could feel them. The first cracks in a city rarely appear as dramatic destruction, because destruction is usually the final stage, while the early stage is discomfort, the creeping realization that essential things are becoming harder to obtain, and that the explanations offered by officials sound less convincing each time they are repeated. A market that once felt noisy and full begins to feel tense, not because the stalls vanish overnight, but because the variety narrows, the best goods disappear first, and the remaining goods grow expensive, forcing ordinary households to spend more time bargaining, and more time worrying, and less time pretending life is stable. When staples become scarce, the city's social order shifts in subtle but powerful ways, because scarcity is not distributed evenly, and unequal scarcity turns difference into resentment. An elite household can still eat because it has stored grain and has the authority to claim more, while a laborer's household begins to ration, and rationing changes the body, changes the mood, changes patience, and changes the willingness to obey the same old rules. Hungry people do not riot because they are irrational, they riot because hunger is an emergency, and an emergency dissolves the polite distance between survival and politics. The palace is often the first target of anger, not only because it represents privilege, but because it is the place where goods are stored, and when a city is under stress, the storeroom becomes a symbol of injustice and a practical solution at the same time. A crowd does not need ideology to move toward the gates. It only needs the simple logic that food exists behind those walls, and once a crowd forms, the old respect for authority can collapse quickly, because authority depends on fear and legitimacy, and both of those weaken when people believe they are already being abandoned. Officials respond by tightening control, because that is what an administrative mind does when faced with instability, yet tightening control can make the cracks widen, because harsher enforcement creates new enemies, and because punishment is costly when soldiers themselves are hungry or unpaid. A guard who once obeyed out of loyalty may begin obeying only for rations, and when rations fail, loyalty becomes a memory, and a memory is not a strong foundation for discipline at a gate when a desperate crowd is pressing forward. Inside city walls, fear rearranges daily behavior. Gates close earlier. Watchmen call out more often. People begin to store what they can, hide what they can, and avoid traveling at night, because night has changed from a quiet pause in routine into a time when raids and theft feel more possible. A city that once welcomed foreign merchants begins to treat foreign accents as warning signs, because when a community is under pressure, it becomes sensitive to difference, and difference becomes easy to blame when causes are complex and invisible. Rumors travel through streets faster than officials can counter them, because rumors require no proof, and because the human mind, under threat, prioritizes information that might prevent harm, even if the information is uncertain. A whispered report of ships seen on the horizon can change a market's mood within an hour, because fear is contagious, and fear turns every ordinary sound into a possible signal of approaching violence. A rumor of grain shipments delayed can provoke hoarding, and hoarding can create the shortage that the rumor predicted, and so the city becomes caught in feedback loops where belief shapes reality. The city's relationship with its countryside becomes strained, because a city eats what the countryside produces, and when the countryside is also under stress, it cannot easily feed an urban population while meeting taxes and maintaining its own survival. Farmers who once brought produce to market may begin to avoid the city, not out of hostility but out of caution, because a hungry city can become predatory, and a cart of grain is an invitation to theft when guards are unreliable. As supply weakens, officials may attempt requisition, and requisition can feel like robbery when households are already thin, and robbery by authority is one of the fastest ways to destroy legitimacy. The poorest quarters feel the tightening first, because they have the least buffer and the least ability to negotiate, and their suffering can become visible in the simplest ways, in thinner bodies, in children crying longer, in more disputes over small items, in more people sleeping in crowded spaces, because shared warmth and shared defense become the cheapest kind of security. Crowding increases disease risk, and disease becomes another invisible pressure that a city is not well equipped to manage, because prevention requires coordination, and coordination is exactly what is weakening. Even without invasion, a stressed city can become unstable from within, because internal conflict thrives when resources shrink, and when rival factions begin to fight for control of remaining wealth and remaining authority. A palace can be challenged by competing elites, a governor can be undermined by local leaders, and a temple can be drawn into politics because religious authority remains persuasive even when administrative authority weakens, and persuasion becomes a weapon in the struggle to define who deserves obedience. There is also a psychological crack that appears when people begin to sense that the gods are not responding in the expected way, because the late Bronze Age worldview depended on the idea that ritual maintains balance, and when disaster persists despite ritual, the community begins to feel spiritually exposed. Priests may demand larger offerings, longer festivals, stricter purity, because intensification is a natural response to fear, yet intensification increases strain on a population already exhausted, creating resentment that can spill into distrust of the very institutions that once offered comfort. When trust in the sacred order weakens, the social order weakens with it, because sacred language is often the glue that convinces people to endure hardship without turning on each other. Outside the walls, the landscape around cities changes, because movement increases as people flee hardship or seek opportunity, and increased movement creates a ring of tension around urban centers, filled with travelers, refugees, displaced families, and armed groups seeking food or shelter. A city's gates, which once managed ordinary traffic, become pressure points where desperate outsiders bargain for entry, and officials must decide whether to admit mouths that will consume scarce supplies or to refuse and risk creating enemies camped nearby. No decision is clean, because generosity can become suicide and refusal can become a siege of hatred. When refugees are admitted, they bring labor and knowledge but also need food, and when they are refused they may become raiders, and thus the city becomes trapped between compassion and security, a trap that has destroyed many communities across history. Even those within the city begin to talk about leaving, because the old prestige of urban life weakens when a city can no longer provide safety, predictable food, and stable markets, and when people talk about leaving they often do so quietly at first, as if speaking the possibility aloud could summon it into reality. The earliest urban cracks can therefore be heard in small sounds, in doors barred earlier, in arguments louder, in prayers more frantic, in the scraping of pots with less food left, and in the uneasy pause people take before trusting an official's reassurance. A scribe may still write as if the palace remains in control, yet the very need to write more orders reveals anxiety, because a stable system does not need constant emergency instructions, it needs routine, and routine is what is slipping away. Sometimes the crack becomes visible in violence that appears sudden, but has been building quietly for months, because when a city reaches a certain threshold of stress, a minor trigger can unleash stored anger the way a spark ignites dry timber. A fight over bread can become a riot. A rumor of betrayal can become an assault on foreigners. A failed payment can become mutiny. And once violence begins, it is difficult to contain, because containment requires trusted authority, and trusted authority is exactly what is being eroded by crisis. It is also possible for a city to collapse without a single spectacular event, through slow abandonment, because if a city cannot feed its population, people drift away, first the most mobile, then the most desperate, then the officials who sense the danger and save themselves, until the streets become quieter and the walls remain standing around emptiness. Abandonment is an invisible kind of destruction, because from a distance the architecture still exists, yet the social life that made it a city has evaporated, leaving behind stones that will later be mistaken for ruins of a sudden catastrophe. In other cases, the crack becomes the invitation that attackers need, because an external force, whether raiders or migrating groups or rival states, watches for weakness, and a weakened city is a prize that can be taken with less cost. When defenders are hungry, when gates are poorly maintained, when internal factions are fighting, and when morale has thinned, the walls that once seemed eternal begin to look like something that can be climbed, and that change in perception is itself fatal, because attackers are encouraged not only by opportunity, but by the belief that the city's spirit is already broken. So the city enters a phase where it still exists, still functions enough for life to continue, yet it feels different, because the confidence that once made urban life worth its concentration has been replaced by the sense of being trapped behind walls that might not protect you, dependent on stores that might not last, and governed by officials who might be lying as much to themselves as to everyone else. This is the moment when the Bronze Age world begins to show its stress on the surface, and when people who once thought in terms of seasons begin to think in terms of days, because they no longer trust that next month will resemble this one. A city can survive hardship as long as it believes hardship is temporary, because belief is the invisible mortar that keeps people cooperating when cooperation is inconvenient. Yet when belief begins to fail, the same streets that once carried routine become corridors of suspicion, where every stranger looks like a threat and every shortage feels like the first hint of starvation. In the late Bronze Age world, urban life depended on a delicate choreography of incoming grain, outgoing goods, enforced labor, and the steady confidence that walls, rulers, and gods together could keep the balance intact. And once that choreography stumbled, the cracks did not stay hidden in storerooms or scribal ledgers, but surfaced in public where everyone could feel them. The first cracks in a city rarely appear as dramatic destruction, because destruction is usually the final stage, while the early stage is discomfort, the creeping realization that essential things are becoming harder to obtain, and that the explanations offered by officials sound less convincing each time they are repeated. A market that once felt noisy and full begins to feel tense, not because the stalls vanish overnight, but because the variety narrows. The best goods disappear first, and the remaining goods grow expensive, forcing ordinary households to spend more time bargaining, and more time worrying, and less time pretending life is stable. When staples become scarce, the city's social order shifts in subtle but powerful ways, because scarcity is not distributed evenly, and unequal scarcity turns difference into resentment. An elite household can still eat because it has stored grain and has the authority to claim more, while a laborer's household begins to ration, and rationing changes the body, changes the mood, changes patience, and changes the willingness to obey the same old rules. Hungry people do not riot because they are irrational, they riot because hunger is an emergency, and an emergency dissolves the polite distance between survival and politics. The palace is often the first target of anger, not only because it represents privilege, but because it is the place where goods are stored, and when a city is under stress, the storeroom becomes a symbol of injustice and a practical solution at the same time. A crowd does not need ideology to move toward the gates. It only needs the simple logic that food exists behind those walls. And once a crowd forms, the old respect for authority can collapse quickly, because authority depends on fear and legitimacy, and both of those weaken when people believe they are already being abandoned. Officials respond by tightening control, because that is what an administrative mind does when faced with instability, yet tightening control can make the cracks widen, because harsher enforcement creates new enemies, and because punishment is costly when soldiers themselves are hungry or unpaid. A guard who once obeyed out of loyalty may begin obeying only for rations, and when rations fail, loyalty becomes a memory, and a memory is not a strong foundation for discipline at a gate when a desperate crowd is pressing forward. Inside city walls, fear rearranges daily behavior. Gates close earlier. Watchmen call out more often. People begin to store what they can, hide what they can, and avoid traveling at night, because night has changed from a quiet pause in routine into a time when raids and theft feel more possible. A city that once welcomed foreign merchants begins to treat foreign accents as warning signs, because when a community is under pressure, it becomes sensitive to difference, and difference becomes easy to blame when causes are complex and invisible. Rumors travel through streets faster than officials can counter them, because rumors require no proof, and because the human mind, under threat, prioritizes information that might prevent harm, even if the information is uncertain. A whispered report of ships seen on the horizon can change a market's mood within an hour, because fear is contagious, and fear turns every ordinary sound into a possible signal of approaching violence. A rumor of grain shipments delayed can provoke hoarding, and hoarding can create the shortage that the rumor predicted, and so the city becomes caught in feedback loops where belief shapes reality. The city's relationship with its countryside becomes strained, because a city eats what the countryside produces, and when the countryside is also under stress, it cannot easily feed an urban population while meeting taxes and maintaining its own survival. Farmers who once brought produce to market may begin to avoid the city, not out of hostility but out of caution, because a hungry city can become predatory, and a cart of grain is an invitation to theft when guards are unreliable. As supply weakens, officials may attempt requisition, and requisition can feel like robbery when households are already thin, and robbery by authority is one of the fastest ways to destroy legitimacy. The poorest quarters feel the tightening first, because they have the least buffer and the least ability to negotiate, and their suffering can become visible in the simplest ways, in thinner bodies, in children crying longer, in more disputes over small items, in more people sleeping in crowded spaces, because shared warmth and shared defense become the cheapest kind of security. Crowding increases disease risk, and disease becomes another invisible pressure that a city is not well equipped to manage, because prevention requires coordination, and coordination is exactly what is weakening. Even without invasion, a stressed city can become unstable from within, because internal conflict thrives when resources shrink, and when rival factions begin to fight for control of remaining wealth and remaining authority. A palace can be challenged by competing elites, a governor can be undermined by local leaders, and a temple can be drawn into politics because religious authority remains persuasive even when administrative authority weakens, and persuasion becomes a weapon in the struggle to define who deserves obedience. There is also a psychological crack that appears when people begin to sense that the gods are not responding in the expected way, because the late Bronze Age worldview depended on the idea that ritual maintains balance, and when disaster persists despite ritual, the community begins to feel spiritually exposed. Priests may demand larger offerings, longer festivals, stricter purity, because intensification is a natural response to fear, yet intensification increases strain on a population already exhausted, creating resentment that can spill into distrust of the very institutions that once offered comfort. When trust in the sacred order weakens, the social order weakens with it, because sacred language is often the glue that convinces people to endure hardship without turning on each other. Outside the walls, the landscape around cities changes, because movement increases as people flee hardship or seek opportunity, and increased movement creates a ring of tension around urban centers, filled with travelers, refugees, displaced families, and armed groups seeking food or shelter. A city's gates, which once managed ordinary traffic, become pressure points where desperate outsiders bargain for entry, and officials must decide whether to admit mouths that will consume scarce supplies or to refuse and risk creating enemies camped nearby. No decision is clean, because generosity can become suicide and refusal can become a siege of hatred. When refugees are admitted, they bring labor and knowledge but also need food, and when they are refused they may become raiders, and thus the city becomes trapped between compassion and security, a trap that has destroyed many communities across history. Even those within the city begin to talk about leaving, because the old prestige of urban life weakens when a city can no longer provide safety, predictable food, and stable markets, and when people talk about leaving they often do so quietly at first, as if speaking the possibility aloud could summon it into reality. The earliest urban cracks can therefore be heard in small sounds, in doors barred earlier, in arguments louder, in prayers more frantic, in the scraping of pots with less food left, and in the uneasy pause people take before trusting an official's reassurance. A scribe may still write as if the palace remains in control, yet the very need to write more orders reveals anxiety, because a stable system does not need constant emergency instructions, it needs routine, and routine is what is slipping away. Sometimes the crack becomes visible in violence that appears sudden, but has been building quietly for months, because when a city reaches a certain threshold of stress, a minor trigger can unleash stored anger the way a spark ignites dry timber. A fight over bread can become a riot. A rumor of betrayal can become an assault on foreigners. A failed payment can become mutiny. And once violence begins, it is difficult to contain, because containment requires trusted authority, and trusted authority is exactly what is being eroded by crisis. It is also possible for a city to collapse without a single spectacular event, through slow abandonment, because if a city cannot feed its population, people drift away, first the most mobile, then the most desperate, then the officials who sense the danger and save themselves, until the streets become quieter and the walls remain standing around emptiness. Abandonment is an invisible kind of destruction, because from a distance the architecture still exists, yet the social life that made it a city has evaporated, leaving behind stones that will later be mistaken for ruins of a sudden catastrophe. In other cases, the crack becomes the invitation that attackers need, because an external force, whether raiders or migrating groups or rival states, watches for weakness, and a weakened city is a prize that can be taken with less cost. When defenders are hungry, when gates are poorly maintained, when internal factions are fighting, and when morale has thinned, the walls that once seemed eternal begin to look like something that can be climbed, and that change in perception is itself fatal, because attackers are encouraged not only by opportunity, but by the belief that the city's spirit is already broken. So the city enters a phase where it still exists, still functions enough for life to continue, yet it feels different, because the confidence that once made urban life worth its concentration has been replaced by the sense of being trapped behind walls that might not protect you, dependent on stores that might not last, and governed by officials who might be lying as much to themselves as to everyone else. This is the moment when the Bronze Age world begins to show its stress on the surface, and when people who once thought in terms of seasons begin to think in terms of days, because they no longer trust that next month will resemble this one. Twos, hunger does not arrive like a stranger at the gate. 0.5s. It arrives like a familiar shadow that grows longer each evening, until one day you notice it has reached the center of the room and will not leave. 0.5s. At first it is only a tightening, a smaller portion, a meal that ends too quickly, a child asking for more and being told to wait, and then it becomes a constant presence that changes how people speak, how they move, how they look at one another, and how they imagine tomorrow. 0.5s. In a world built on grain, hunger is never only physical. 0.5s. It is political because it alters obedience. 0.5s. It is economic because it reshapes exchange. 0.5s. It is psychological because it narrows thought until survival becomes the only language the mind can speak without effort. 0.5s. Scarcity turns ordinary routines into negotiations. 0.5s. A loaf becomes a question, oil becomes a guarded substance, and every jar, every sack, every measure is handled with a kind of reverence that is really fear wearing the mask of carefulness. 0.5s. In the marketplace, voices sharpen, because politeness is a luxury and luxury disappears quickly when people begin to sense that there may not be enough to go around. 0.5s. The first stage of hunger is often denial, because denial allows people to pretend that the world is still normal, and normality is one of the last comforts available when the earth has begun to fail. 0.5s. A household stretches grain by mixing it with whatever can be gathered, by watering stew until it becomes thin, by pretending that smaller portions are a matter of discipline rather than need, and by telling children stories to distract them from the emptiness in their stomachs. 0.5s. But bodies keep their own records, and the body does not accept stories as food. 0.5s. Weakness creeps into arms and legs. 0.5s. Illness arrives more easily. 0.5s. Old wounds heal more slowly. 0.5s. Work feels heavier, not because it has changed, but because the fuel required to perform it is no longer present in sufficient amount. 0.5s. When hunger persists, something else grows alongside it, something quieter but just as destructive. 0.5s. Debt. 0.5s. Debt is hunger given paperwork, hunger turned into obligation, hunger made legible to those who profit from it. 0.5s. A household that cannot meet a palace quota, cannot replace a poor harvest, or cannot endure the lean months turns to borrowing because borrowing promises time, and time is the one thing drought steals most efficiently. 0.5s. At first the loan can feel almost merciful, a portion of grain now, repayment later, and the comforting belief that the next season will restore what was lost. 0.5s. But comfort rests on assumption, and when seasons remain unreliable, assumption becomes a trapdoor. 0.5s. The late Bronze Age world already demanded much from ordinary people. 0.5s. Taxes to the palace, offerings to the temple, labor for walls, roads, workshops, and estates, and obedience when officials arrived with seals and lists. 0.5s. Debt adds another weight to shoulders already bent, and layered weights crush endurance, not through a single dramatic moment, but through slow exhaustion that teaches people to stop believing in rescue. 0.5s. As debt deepens, households begin to surrender what they once would have considered untouchable. 0.5s. Animals are sold early not because it is wise, but because hunger is immediate and wisdom requires patience. 0.5s. Tools are pledged, pots are traded, cloth is exchanged, and heirlooms disappear into the hands of those who still possess reserves, because in crisis, memory becomes a currency that can be spent, and many are forced to spend it. 0.5s. The loss of tools is not only a loss of property, but a loss of future capacity, because a plow is not a symbol, it is an engine of survival, and to lose it is to reduce the harvest that might have allowed repayment. 0.5s. The household sacrifices tomorrow to survive today, and then must sacrifice tomorrow again, because tomorrow never arrives in the shape they were promised. 0.5s. Debt has a way of expanding into a relationship of power. 0.5s. A creditor does not merely lend grain, he gains leverage, because leverage is what remains when material is scarce. 0.5s. He gains the ability to demand repayment not only in grain but in labor, and labor demanded under coercion changes the meaning of a life. 0.5s. This is how debt becomes bondage. 0.5s. Not always openly at first, not always announced with cruelty, but through incremental steps that feel, in the moment, like the only available choice. 0.5s. A person works a portion of time for the creditor, then a larger portion, then the work becomes permanent, and what was once a neighbor becomes an owner of days. 0.5s. A household that loses autonomy loses more than freedom. 0.5s. It loses dignity, because dignity requires the ability to refuse. 0.5s. It loses security, because security requires control over one's own labor. 0.5s. And it loses trust, because trust cannot survive when relationships become chains. 0.5s. Inside villages, hunger and debt reshape social bonds into sharper hierarchies. 0.5s. Those who still have reserves become the ones who decide terms, and those without reserves become the ones who accept them, and acceptance changes a person's posture toward the community. 0.5s. A village that once felt like a net begins to feel like a ladder, with some climbing and others slipping downward. 0.5s. Generosity becomes complicated. 0.5s. To share food is to risk one's own children, and so compassion fights with fear inside the same heart. 0.5s. Some continue to share until they cannot. Some stop sharing early in order to protect their household, and some share only strategically, turning aid into influence the way the palace turns grain into obedience. 0.5s. Shame grows in the spaces where hunger lives. 0.5s. A man who cannot feed his family feels the world judging him even when no one speaks, and this shame can turn inward into despair or outward into anger. 0.5s. A woman who must bargain for smaller portions feels the eyes of neighbors, and the eyes of neighbors can be as heavy as any official demand. 0.5s. Children learn quickly that the world has changed. 0.5s. They learn by the silence at meals, by the arguments whispered at night, by the way adults pause before opening jars as if opening a jar is opening a wound. 0.5s. They learn by the absence of small joys, because famine does not only remove food, it removes festivals and songs and idle laughter, replacing them with calculation. 0.5s. In cities, hunger takes on a different texture, because urban life depends on exchange, and exchange becomes brutal when supply thins. 0.5s. Prices rise, and rising prices do not merely reflect scarcity, they amplify it, because the poor are the first to be priced out of survival. 0.5s. A market can still appear full while many cannot afford what is displayed, and this sight creates resentment sharper than emptiness, because it is a reminder that abundance exists, but not for everyone. 0.5s. Officials attempt to preserve order through rationing and controlled distribution, because administration tries to hold chaos at arm's length. 0.5s. Lines form, people wait, and waiting becomes a kind of humiliation, because waiting implies dependence, and dependence is bitter when it is enforced by hunger. 0.5s. An official's calm voice can sound like mockery when the crowd's stomachs are empty, and a seal on a tablet is not comforting when the tablet cannot become bread. 0.5s. The palace may open granaries, yet opening granaries is both relief and confession. 0.5s. It admits that normal flow has failed. 0.5s. It admits that reserves are being consumed. 0.5s. And it invites questions that are dangerous for power, because once people see the inside of a system, they begin to wonder whether the system is truly fair. 0.5s. Religion becomes louder in cities as well, because loudness is often the response to fear. 0.5s. Priests call for offerings, for purity, for renewed obedience, insisting that the gods will restore balance if the people correct whatever has angered heaven. 0.5s. For some, this provides comfort, because comfort is scarce and ritual offers structure, but for others it becomes a source of bitterness, because an offering demanded from hunger feels like theft disguised as holiness. 0.5s. Hunger changes how people interpret authority. 0.5s. A tax collector arriving in a thin year is no longer a routine visitor, but a threat, because routine demands feel like cruelty when routine conditions have vanished. 0.5s. A soldier demanding supplies can be seen as protector one day and predator the next, depending on whether he gives safety or takes food. 0.5s. A palace decree insisting on stability can be heard as a lie, because the body knows when stability is false. 0.5s. When the moral logic that supports obedience begins to fail, the system becomes vulnerable from below. 0.5s. Not through ideology, not through grand speeches, but through exhaustion, because a person cannot carry what the system demands forever. 0.5s. Eventually the body refuses, and the refusal may look like theft, flight, or quiet noncompliance, yet each refusal is a withdrawal of labor from the machinery that requires labor to live. 0.5s. This is when people begin to move. 0.5s. At first the movement is small, almost hidden, because leaving a village is like tearing oneself out of a net of kinship, memory, and burial ground. 0.5s. Families slip away before dawn, carrying bundles, leading thin animals, choosing uncertainty because uncertainty has become preferable to slow, predictable starvation. 0.5s. Movement becomes contagious, not because it is romantic, but because it is logical. 0.5s. When one family leaves and survives, others notice. 0.5s. When several leave, the village loses labor, fields go untended, repairs are postponed, and the remaining community becomes weaker, making departure even more attractive for those who can still walk. 0.5s. A village that loses households loses resilience. 0.5s. Irrigation channels clog, terraces crumble, and the collective work that once maintained the land becomes impossible when too many hands have vanished. 0.5s. The land then produces less, which deepens hunger, which deepens debt, which increases movement, and the spiral tightens. 0.5s. Rulers fear this kind of collapse because it is difficult to punish. 0.5s. A city can be threatened with an army, but an empty village cannot be coerced into producing surplus. 0.5s. Officials can demand lists of laborers, but lists cannot summon people who have already gone. 0.5s. So coercion increases where coercion still can. 0.5s. Penalties sharpen, enforcement becomes harsher, and the state tries to bind people to land that no longer feeds them, because the state understands order as immobility. 0.5s. But coercion is risky when people are already near the edge, because fear loses its power when hunger has become familiar, and familiar suffering makes rebellion seem less frightening than submission. 0.5s. Desperation also changes roads. 0.5s. The hungry become willing to steal, and theft becomes common, and common theft becomes banditry, and banditry turns travel into danger. 0.5s. Merchants reduce journeys, caravans travel with heavier guards, costs rise, and the flow of goods becomes thinner, which deepens urban scarcity and reinforces the very hunger that created the violence. 0.5s. Small acts of violence multiply. 0.5s. A stolen sack provokes retaliation, retaliation provokes feud, and feud makes neighbors into enemies, because in a tight world, a personal conflict can become a structural fracture. 0.5s. When the social fabric tears, the state must spend resources to control unrest, yet resources are exactly what the state lacks, and so control becomes brittle. 0.5s. Debt, hunger, and movement therefore feed one another like a dark machinery. 0.5s. Debt makes people vulnerable. 0.5s. Vulnerability makes them desperate. 0.5s. Desperation makes them move or break rules. 0.5s. Broken rules make officials harsher. 0.5s. Harsher officials deepen resentment. 0.5s. Resentment deepens instability. 0.5s. Instability disrupts trade and labor. 0.5s. Disruption deepens hunger again. 0.5s. This is how order begins to crumble from the bottom. 0.5s. Not because a king falls, not because a palace burns, not because a foreign fleet suddenly appears, but because ordinary people reach the point where they can no longer participate in the system without dying. 0.5s. When a system demands survival sacrifices without providing survival guarantees, people begin to withdraw, quietly at first, then in waves, and each withdrawal is a missing stone in a wall that was never as solid as it looked. 0.5s. By the end of this chapter, the world is not yet in flames, but it is thinning. 0.5s. Fields stand with fewer hands to tend them, villages hold fewer voices, roads feel more dangerous, markets feel more tense, and the palace feels farther away, not in distance, but in meaning. 0.5s. Hunger has begun to rewrite relationships into chains, debt has begun to turn future into property, and desperation has begun to teach people that leaving may be the only remaining form of choice. 2s. Fire begins as a tool, as warmth, as light, as the obedient flame that cooks bread and hardens clay, and keeps night at a distance. And this familiarity is what makes the first great burnings so terrifying, because the same element that serves a household can also erase an entire city without asking permission. A city does not imagine itself ending in smoke, because cities are built as arguments against impermanence, with walls that insist on endurance and archives that insist on continuity. Yet fire does not debate, and when it takes hold it speaks in only one language. The earliest fires of collapse were not always announced by trumpets or invaders seen clearly on the horizon. Often they arrived at the end of a chain of smaller failures, when hunger had already narrowed patience, when debt had already sharpened resentment, when guards had already grown unreliable, and when the trust that normally holds a crowded place together had already thinned to something brittle. A dense city is a beautiful danger. Wooden beams run through roofs like dry veins. Storage rooms are filled with oil sealed in jars that can become fuel. Workshops keep charcoal and kindling ready, and narrow streets funnel wind through tight spaces, so that once flame escapes its intended boundaries, it can move with speed that feels almost alive. Even in peace, fire is always near, because civilization itself depends on it, and so every city lives with a quiet risk embedded in its own design. When crisis grows, that risk increases, not because flame becomes different, but because people become different. Maintenance is postponed, because labor is scarce and attention is exhausted. Guards grow careless, because they are hungry or unpaid. Order weakens, because the palace cannot distribute enough to keep everyone invested in calm. A spark that would once have been contained becomes, in such a moment, a beginning that cannot easily be ended. Some fires may have begun as accidents, because accidents become more likely when a society is strained, when people cook with less care, when storage is more crowded, and when the routine discipline of daily life breaks down under pressure. But many fires carry the shape of intention, because flame is also a weapon, and a weapon is often chosen when other tools have failed. A raider does not need to hold a city forever to destroy it, because destruction can be achieved quickly, and fire is the fastest way to turn a palace into panic. To burn a city is to burn its confidence. The moment smoke rises, the illusion of control collapses, because officials may command, yet command cannot smother flame once it spreads across roofs, and the crowd begins to move according to fear rather than law. Fear has its own logic, and its logic is simple, because it values escape over property, life over loyalty, and immediate survival over any long-term obligation. Imagine the first moments. A shout. A sudden brightness reflected on walls. The smell of burning oil or resin, sharp and unmistakable. Then the wind feeds the flame, and the flame feeds the wind, and the city, which was meant to be a controlled concentration of human life, becomes a concentrated opportunity for fire to consume everything that is dry. People run toward wells and cisterns with jars and buckets, and some try to form lines, because habit clings even in panic, yet panic breaks lines, because those closest to the fire do not have time to be orderly. A family drags children through smoke, a craftsman tries to save tools, a scribe tries to save tablets, and each attempt is a private act of resistance against erasure, yet the fire does not negotiate with private resistance. The most terrifying aspect of a city fire is not only that it destroys, but that it destroys without preference, taking the rich roof and the poor roof alike, turning hierarchy into ash. When a palace burns, something more than wood collapses. The palace is not simply a building, but an administrative heart, a place where rations are tallied, labor is assigned, tribute is stored, and the authority of the ruler is made visible through architecture. If that heart stops, the city can still hold bodies, but it cannot easily hold coordination, and coordination is the true reason a large city can exist at all. Inside palatial storerooms, the very wealth that once signaled power becomes a danger. Oil burns fiercely, textiles ignite quickly, wooden beams feed the blaze, and the heat becomes so intense that clay hardens, seals crack, and rooms turn into ovens that no one can enter. A city can lose years of accumulated surplus in hours, and surplus lost is not only economic loss, but loss of the city's ability to survive the next hardship. This is why the first fires matter so much in the story of collapse. They are not merely dramatic events, but accelerants, turning slow weakening into sudden catastrophe, because a society already strained cannot easily absorb the sudden destruction of its center. A community can endure hunger for a time, yet a community without storerooms, without workshops, without archives, without walls maintained by organized labor, becomes something else, something closer to survival than to civilization. The archaeological layers left by these fires are quiet proof of a world interrupted. Burnt debris sealed on floors, blackened beams collapsed into rooms, and hardened tablets preserved in the very destruction that ended their usefulness, all of it suggesting that people did not calmly relocate and rebuild in the old way. Because the most haunting pattern is not that cities burned, as cities have always burned, but that some cities burned and did not return. Rebuilding requires more than courage. It requires surplus to feed laborers who cannot farm while they rebuild. It requires materials to replace what was lost. It requires political stability to prevent rebuilding from being destroyed again. And it requires belief that the future will reward the effort, which is the most fragile requirement of all when a society has begun to suspect the future may not exist in the old form. So the first fires often mark a threshold where the assumptions behind rebuilding no longer hold. A ruler may still claim authority, yet authority without resources becomes hollow, and a hollow authority cannot command thousands of hands to raise walls again. A temple may still demand offerings, yet offerings are difficult to demand from people who have lost homes, food, and the sense that the gods are still keeping order. Sometimes, after a burning, people return briefly, not to restore the city, but to pick through what remains. They search for metal and ash, for unbroken jars, for any salvage that can be carried away, and this scavenging has a different feeling than rebuilding, because it treats the city not as a home to be restored, but as a carcass to be harvested. When scavenging becomes the primary relationship to ruins, the city's social meaning has already changed. The roads around such a destroyed place become haunted. Travelers pass and see blackened stones, smell old smoke after rain, and feel the unsettling presence of a silence that is too large for the landscape. News spreads because burning is visible from far away, and visibility is a kind of message that no palace can censor. If one city burns, neighboring communities begin to wonder who will be next, and fear is contagious even among those who still possess full granaries. Fear changes behavior. People hoard more fiercely because they imagine siege or flight. Merchants travel less because roads feel unsafe. Local strongmen demand more because they sense authority weakening. And every one of these changes increases strain on the remaining system, making further violence more likely. It is possible that some of the first fires were sparked by internal unrest rather than external attack. When the social contract breaks, when the palace is no longer seen as protector but as extractor, anger can turn toward the visible center of power. A crowd may not have the weapons to defeat an army in the field, yet it can burn a storeroom, it can overwhelm a gate, it can kill officials, and it can make the palace uninhabitable, and those acts can be enough to topple an already weakened order. A city is particularly vulnerable to this kind of internal violence because its walls also trap its own panic. The more centralized the system, the more people associate their suffering with the center, and when resentment reaches a certain heat, fire becomes not only destruction but statement. It says, without words, that the old relationship is over. Yet even when fires are deliberate, they are not always part of a coherent plan, because collapse is not a single mind making decisions, but many minds reacting to fear. Raiders burn to prevent pursuit, to disrupt, to loot without resistance. Rebels burn to punish elites, to seize stored wealth, to release themselves from obligations. Accidents burn because too many stresses have turned the ordinary into dangerous. And the result is the same, which is the sudden transformation of a functioning city into a place that no longer functions. Once a city burns and does not rebuild, its disappearance creates a gap in the network. Trade routes lose a hub. Diplomatic routes lose a partner. Roads lose maintenance. And the surrounding countryside loses a center that once provided markets, protection, and redistribution, even if those benefits were never evenly shared. This is why the first fires matter as more than tragedy. They are structural events, removing nodes from a web that was already strained, and each removal increases the load on what remains. A world that once depended on multiple strong cities begins to rely on fewer, and fewer means less redundancy, and less redundancy means more fragility. The emotional weight of fire also endures. A person who has fled a burning city carries the memory in the nervous system, in the way he wakes at night, in the way he watches the horizon, in the way he mistrusts crowded places, and this mistrust changes how communities form afterward. Refugees bring stories that can destabilize the places that receive them, because a story of a palace burning is also a story that the gods did not stop it, and that walls did not protect it, and that elites could not prevent it. When enough of these stories circulate, the psychological architecture of the age begins to fail. The Late Bronze Age depended on belief in continuity, in hierarchy, in the idea that order would always return after disturbance, yet a city that burns and remains empty is a disturbance that does not end. It becomes a permanent scar that teaches people a new lesson, which is that the old world can die. So the first fires are not only flames. They are signals, visible from far away, that something fundamental has changed. They announce that the machinery of palace life can stop, that archives can fall silent, that workshops can go cold, and that the people who once kept the system alive can be scattered into roads and hills. By the end of this chapter, we are not yet at the moment when every great center has fallen, but we have crossed a threshold, because once the first major cities burn without rebuilding, collapse ceases to be a theory and becomes a landscape. Smoke becomes a kind of geography. Ruins become landmarks. And the world that once relied on the predictable return of order begins to realize, slowly and with dread, that some things do not return at all. They arrive first as rumor, because rumor travels faster than ships, and because fear is always eager to believe that the trouble it senses in the air must have a face. Along coasts and in port markets, people begin to speak of unfamiliar sails, of strange prows cutting through water at the wrong season, of coastal villages that go quiet too quickly, and of merchants who return with less cargo than expected and more caution than they can explain. At the edge of the sea, where land meets the wide and indifferent surface that connects kingdoms, it can be difficult to tell whether a figure on the horizon is opportunity or threat until it is already close enough to matter. A ship can be trade one day and violence the next, and when a world is already strained by shortage and movement, the difference between those two possibilities becomes thin, because hunger makes everyone more willing to take, and fear makes everyone more ready to strike first. The phrase we use now, the sea peoples, carries an illusion of certainty, as if the waves delivered a single united force with a single plan, yet the reality, as far as we can reconstruct it, feels far less clean. What appears in the records is not a tidy identity but a cluster of names, a shifting set of groups whose origins blur, whose alliances may have been temporary, and whose motivations may have included everything from raiding to migration, from desperation to ambition, from flight to conquest. This uncertainty is part of what makes them haunting. A clear enemy can be confronted, negotiated with, defeated, or absorbed, but a moving constellation of people, appearing and disappearing along coastlines, can destabilize an entire region simply by refusing to be understood. When people say they did not know what was coming, this is often what they mean, not that they lacked intelligence, but that the shape of the threat did not hold still long enough to be named with confidence. Egyptian sources speak of groups with names that sound like echoes from a vanished world, names like Shurden, Shikalesh, Cheker, Denyen, Weshish, and Peleset, and the act of naming is itself an attempt at control, because a named threat feels less infinite than an unnamed one. Yet even these names do not tell us everything, because a name can represent an ethnicity, a coalition, a military band, a displaced population, or a label imposed by outsiders who are trying to describe something they do not fully grasp. What makes the Sea Peoples different from ordinary piracy is the sense, preserved in later depictions and inscriptions, that movement included not only fighters but families, not only weapons but carts, animals, possessions, and the quiet infrastructure of survival. A raiding fleet is hungry for plunder, but it does not usually bring its children, and when children appear in the shadow of conflict, the story becomes more complex, because now violence and migration overlap in the same silhouette. Imagine the shoreline at dusk. The tide retreats. Fishermen pull in nets. A watchman stands where the land drops into the sea, scanning the horizon out of habit more than panic, and then, on a day that feels like any other day, he sees shapes that do not match the familiar profile of local traders. Perhaps the sails are arranged differently. Perhaps the ships sit lower or move in a tighter grouping. Perhaps the timing is wrong, the season wrong, the confidence of their approach wrong. The city hears about it in fragments. A runner arrives from a small coastal settlement with breathless urgency. A merchant reports that a harbor farther along the coast refused entry to strangers. A fisherman claims to have seen smoke from a village that should not be burning. Each fragment alone can be dismissed, because a world under stress is always full of fragments, yet the danger lies in the pattern they form when placed together. The Sea Peoples, however we define them, appear within a context already primed for collapse, and that context matters more than any single battle. Trade networks are fraying. Harvests have failed in places. Debt and movement have intensified. Cities have begun to burn without rebuilding. In such a landscape, even a moderate increase in raiding or migration can become catastrophic, because resilience has already been spent. A strong state can absorb disruption. A wounded state cannot. And the late Bronze Age powers, for all their grandeur, were increasingly wounded by forces they could not command, because no palace decree can restore a storm-lost cargo, no ritual can guarantee safe passage, and no wall can extend itself across the open sea. Egypt presents the most vivid surviving images, because Egypt preserved memory in stone, and stone endures when archives of clay have been scattered or burned. In later monumental narratives, the foreigners are depicted with distinctive dress and equipment, some with horned helmets and artistic representation, some with round shields, and the scenes convey the sense of a clash not merely between armies, but between entire ways of moving through the world. There are ships crowded in close combat, bodies falling into water, archers on shore, and the rigid insistence that order has triumphed, because Egyptian royal art is not a neutral report but a claim. A claim, however, is still evidence of anxiety. Empires carve victories into walls when they need the world to believe in them, and the louder the stone declares triumph, the more we can suspect the rulers felt the ground shifting beneath their certainty. Propaganda is a kind of prayer, asking reality to conform to the narrative, and a narrative becomes more necessary when reality becomes less cooperative. It is possible, and increasingly plausible, that what Egypt faced was not only a wave of attackers from the sea, but a larger movement of people set in motion by the same pressures we have already traced: climate stress, famine, political instability, and the collapse of old centers that once anchored populations in place. When a palace falls, workers scatter. When fields fail, farmers move. When trade collapses, port communities lose their lifeline. When multiple such failures overlap, the sea becomes not merely a route for commerce, but a route for survival. But survival movements do not remain peaceful simply because they begin in desperation. Desperate people need food. They need land. They need safety. And when they arrive in a new place, they encounter others who also need food, land, and safety, and in such encounters, violence can erupt even without ideology, because scarcity makes every meeting feel like a competition for existence. The coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean were especially vulnerable, because they relied on the sea for exchange, and the sea can turn from highway to hazard without warning. A harbor that once promised connection could suddenly promise invasion. A ship that once carried copper and oil could carry fighters, and a flotilla that once arrived under a flag of trade could arrive with no flag at all, because in collapse, rituals of courtesy become optional. We must also remember that many of the states in this period depended on relatively thin military margins. Chariot warfare, elite warrior classes, and centralized armories can create dazzling displays of power, yet they can also create a brittle system that fails quickly when supply lines break. If bronze becomes scarce, if horses become harder to feed, if trained crews cannot be maintained, the very military style that once secured dominance can become impossible to sustain. So a moving group arriving by sea could meet defenses that look strong in theory, but are weakened in practice. A wall is impressive, but it needs guards. A gate is strong, but it needs discipline. A navy is decisive, but it needs timber, skilled labor, and stable ports. And when the interior is hungry and the periphery is restless, those requirements become harder to fulfill. There is a particular terror in the sea as a direction of threat, because the sea offers fewer warnings than land. An army on land can be tracked by scouts, delayed by geography, slowed by supply, and met at passes, but ships can appear abruptly, and once they land, the battle is already within the most vulnerable zone of the coastal settlement. To defend against the sea is to defend against uncertainty itself. And uncertainty encourages overreaction. When a state does not know whether newcomers are traders, refugees, or raiders, it may treat them as the worst option, and in doing so, it can create the very hostility it feared. A desperate group denied entry might raid to survive. A trading group attacked might respond with violence. A rumor of invasion might trigger a preemptive strike that turns coastlines into war zones. The names that survive, Shurden, Shikalesh, Denyen, Checker, Weshish, Peleset, sound like pieces of a shattered mirror, reflecting a wider movement that we can only partly reconstruct. Some of these groups may have served as mercenaries at times, integrated into foreign armies, then later reappeared as enemies, because in a collapsing world, loyalty can shift quickly, and the same warrior band can fight for a king one year and against his successor the next. Others may have been coastal populations displaced by earlier destruction, pushed into the sea as the last remaining path. One of the most haunting possibilities is that the sea peoples were not an external anomaly, but a symptom, a visible surge produced by the same internal breakdown that was already unfolding across the region. When a system collapses, it does not only fall inward, it spills outward, turning its displaced people into moving forces that reshape other lands. In this way, collapse becomes contagious, not through a single invading army, but through waves of human motion driven by necessity. Imagine what it means for a family to load possessions into a cart and approach a shoreline. It means the land behind them no longer offers enough to stay. It means the city that once protected them is gone or hostile. It means the fields no longer yield. And it means the sea, with all its danger, now appears as a chance rather than a threat. Now imagine such families multiplied, moving together, accompanied by fighters because the road is dangerous, and because a moving people without weapons becomes prey. The presence of fighters changes everything, because it makes settlement negotiations feel like invasion, yet the fighters may simply be the hardened edge of a larger desperate migration. The receiving society sees the edge and assumes the whole is a blade. Egypt, protected by geography and by its long tradition of centralized resilience, could endure what others could not, yet even Egypt's survival, as we will see, comes with strain and transformation. For smaller coastal states, for port cities that depended on steady exchange, the appearance of hostile or unknown ships could be fatal, because a single burning could end their role in the network, and without rebuilding, the loss becomes permanent. This is why the sea peoples occupy such a powerful place in the imagination. They appear as figures at the edge of visibility, arriving when the world is already weakening, accelerating collapse in some places, exploiting it in others, and embodying the terror of a world where borders no longer hold and identities no longer feel stable. Yet it is important to sit with the ambiguity rather than erase it, because ambiguity is historically honest, and because the people living through this period would have felt that ambiguity in their bones. They would not have known whether the next sail on the horizon carried trade or death, whether the strangers landing on the beach were hungry families or organized raiders, whether the violence they suffered was a unique event or the beginning of an age of constant threat. They would have known only that the sea, once a highway of exchange, had become a mirror reflecting the collapse back at them, delivering it in the form of human motion. So in this chapter, listen to the sea not as a romantic expanse, but as a dark corridor through which uncertainty travels. Hear the creak of oars, the slap of water against hulls, the shouted commands in unfamiliar tongues, the crying of children in crowded boats, the clatter of weapons carried by men who have learned that mercy is rare when survival is at stake. And feel the dread of the shoreline settlements, where watchfires burn not as welcome but as warning, where gates are closed more often, where merchants begin to vanish, and where the horizon, once associated with wealth, becomes a place people stare at with the uneasy certainty that something is coming. A great empire rarely dies in a single clean moment, because power is not one thing that can be snapped, but many things braided together, roads and harvests and loyalty and fear and habit, all of them holding as long as they are tightened in the right direction. When the braid loosens, it loosens first at the edges, where distance makes obedience expensive and where local survival matters more than imperial ceremony, and only later does the weakness reach the center that once believed it could command the world by writing commands onto clay. The Hittite realm had been built on the ability to organize distance, to make faraway places behave as if they were close, to turn mountains and valleys into manageable space through administration, diplomacy, and force, and to convince scattered communities that the safest future lay in serving a great king whose reach extended beyond any single horizon. That reach depended on movement, because an inland empire survives through roads, through caravans, through the steady inward drift of grain, animals, timber, and labor, and through the outward drift of authority, protection, and punishment, like breath moving in and out of a body. Hattusa stood as the heart of this system, fortified, elevated, disciplined by walls and gates that seemed to argue against vulnerability, and for a long time the argument held. Yet an inland capital is also a hungry machine, because it consumes food every day, consumes timber, consumes metals and tools, consumes the labor of thousands, and the moment the feeding slows, the machine begins to grind, and grinding produces heat, and heat produces fracture. In the palace, scribes turned the world into marks, because a mark on clay is a kind of capture, a way to pin a moving reality down so that officials can count it, store it, threaten it, and redistribute it. Tribute became a list, labor became a schedule, rations became a set of entitlements, and obligations became something that could be measured, corrected, and enforced, which is the great ambition of bureaucracy, to make human life predictable enough to control. But predictability is not produced by tablets. It is produced by surplus, and surplus is produced by stable seasons and stable routes, and stability was becoming rarer across the wider world. When harvests thin or arrive late, the countryside does not merely suffer, it reorders its priorities, because a hungry village looks at imperial demands and begins to see them as a threat rather than a duty. A tax in a good year can be endured as routine. A tax in a thin year becomes a wound. And when a wound is reopened repeatedly, resentment becomes as natural as breathing. The periphery is where empires first hear the sound of their own weakness. A provincial governor delays a shipment. A vassal city answers more slowly. A local strongman begins to behave like a king in miniature, not because he dreams of rebellion as a philosophy, but because the center's protection feels uncertain, and uncertainty forces people to build their own shelter. Distance turns into opportunity when the capital cannot respond quickly, and the capital cannot respond quickly when its own resources are strained, and strain spreads like cold through a body. The Hittite state had always managed multiple kinds of pressure: rival kingdoms, uneasy borderlands, highland raiders who could strike and vanish into terrain, and the constant requirement to keep roads open through country that does not remain obedient by default. Such pressures are survivable when the center is strong, because strength provides margin, and margin allows mistakes, delays, and emergencies to be absorbed without breaking the frame. When margin disappears, every disruption becomes heavier, and the same pressures that once felt normal begin to feel fatal, because there is no longer extra grain, extra labor, extra patience, extra time. Time is often the most precious resource in collapse, because time is what allows repair, negotiation, and rebuilding, and a state under strain begins to lose time the way a drowning person loses breath, in shorter and shorter intervals. A road goes unsafe. A caravan travels less. A storeroom thins. Rations tighten. Workers grow desperate. Desperate workers become less reliable. Maintenance slips. And the slipping itself becomes an accelerant, because a neglected road invites bandits, and bandits reduce movement, and reduced movement deepens shortage, and shortage sharpens fear. Diplomacy, so central to late Bronze Age power, also becomes brittle under scarcity, because alliances depend on confidence, and confidence depends on the ability to send gifts, provisions, and help without risking one's own collapse. A king who once could reassure allies with generosity now must calculate every shipment, every promise, every commitment, and calculation can look like weakness to those who are already watching for signs that they must begin to fend for themselves. In a world where multiple powers are strained at once, mutual aid becomes harder precisely when it is most needed, and the failure of aid feels like abandonment even when it is simply inability. Inside Hattusa, the rituals of power may continue, because institutions often keep performing stability, even when stability has become theater, and theater can buy time by persuading people to keep believing. Ceremonies still take place. Official language still insists on order. The palace still tries to sound like a center. Yet behind the voice, anxiety grows, and anxiety changes the way commands are written, because fear makes writing sharper, more urgent, more insistent, as if intensity could substitute for resources. A command becomes harsher when compliance is no longer automatic. A request becomes a demand. A demand becomes a threat. And threats, when repeated, turn loyalty into something that looks obedient on the surface and rotten beneath, because obedience maintained only by fear collapses the moment fear becomes less frightening than hunger. Enemies do not need to be unified to destroy a weakened empire. A system that is already cracking can be shattered by many hands acting separately, because each pressure finds a different fracture line. Highland raiders exploit thin defenses. Border rivals test fortresses. Coastal disruptions sever communication and supply. Internal factions seize opportunities. And the center, trying to respond everywhere at once, discovers the terrible truth that an empire cannot be strong in every direction when its resources are failing. One of the most haunting aspects of the Hittite collapse is the suddenness of its written silence. A living bureaucracy produces endless clay heartbeat, rations, treaties, inventories, orders, diplomatic messages, the steady proof of itself, and then when the mechanism fails, the proof stops. It does not taper gently. It breaks. The absence becomes a kind of negative evidence, an empty space where administration should be, suggesting not a peaceful transition but a catastrophic discontinuity. Hattusa is abandoned. That word contains an entire world of fear, because abandonment is not simply losing a battle. It is the decision that a capital has become more dangerous than the uncertainty outside its walls. It means the storerooms are no longer reliable. It means the walls can no longer be confidently manned. It means the officials cannot guarantee coordination. And it means the people who sustain the city no longer believe it can sustain them. Imagine the last days in a place built to feel permanent. The sound of carts in courtyards, not bringing tribute in, but carrying possessions out. The closing of rooms that once held daily work. The hurried gathering of household goods by families who never expected to leave. The tension in the faces of guards who know that a wall is only as strong as the men willing to hold it. The quiet decisions made at night, when people weigh staying against leaving and realize that staying now means trusting a system that has already failed too many times. Not everyone leaves at once, because collapse is rarely orderly. Some depart early, sensing danger before others can accept it. Some remain because leaving means abandoning identity, property, and the graves of ancestors, and those things are not easily surrendered even when survival demands surrender. Some may be forced out by violence. Some may flee a kind of emptiness, the emptiness of a city that can no longer function as a city, where the routines that once produced safety have become unreliable and therefore frightening. When the center empties, power changes shape. A palace without officials is only architecture. A temple without ritual is only a room. A gate without guards is only an opening. And a capital without belief is no longer a capital, because authority is ultimately a shared agreement that certain places matter, and once the agreement dissolves, stone becomes simply stone. The archives fall silent, and in some cruel irony, destruction preserves what administration wrote for daily use. Heat bakes clay harder, making tablets survive as fossils of a world that no longer exists. Yet survival of text is not survival of meaning, because a ration list without a palace to enforce it is only a relic, and a treaty without a partner state is only a memory pressed into clay. What remains is evidence of coordination without coordination, proof of command without command, the skeleton of a system that has lost its flesh. The disappearance of the Hittite Empire therefore feels like a vanishing, not because people evaporate, but because imperial coherence evaporates, and coherence is what makes an empire visible across time. Communities remain, languages remain, local powers remain, yet the great frame that once organized them into a single political body breaks apart into smaller, harsher units that are shaped by immediate survival rather than imperial ideology. Roads change their meaning. A road that once carried tribute becomes a road that carries refugees. A road that once carried officials becomes a road avoided for fear of bandits. A fortress that once symbolized imperial reach becomes a local stronghold serving whoever can feed the men inside it, because loyalty follows food when the old guarantees collapse. Treaties lose their power when the institutions that maintain them collapse, because a treaty is not magic, it is enforcement, and enforcement requires stability. Promises once spoken with ceremonial grandeur become worthless when the signatories are gone or weakened, and the world becomes more fragmented not by philosophy, but by practical necessity, as each community tries to build a smaller shelter within a larger storm. The fall reverberates outward because the Hittite state had been a major pillar in the late Bronze Age balance of power. When a pillar collapses, everything above shifts, and those already strained by drought, hunger, migration, and coastal insecurity suddenly find themselves in a world with fewer stabilizing forces. Allies lose a counterweight. Rivals lose a boundary. Trade networks lose an anchor in Anatolia. And the psychological certainty that palace civilization will always rebuild and always return weakens further, because if a great king can abandon his own heartland, then no palace is truly secure. The silence left behind is not passive. Silence creates space, and space invites movement, and movement invites new conflicts, new settlements, new raids, new alliances formed in the rough logic of survival rather than the polished language of diplomacy. Where an empire once stood, a patchwork grows and patchwork spreads, changing the shape of the region and preparing the ground for further collapse elsewhere, because a world that loses one of its great centers becomes a world with less margin, less coordination, and less memory of how stability once felt. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece were built to look unshakable, with stone walls that seemed to promise permanence and with storerooms that turned harvest, labor, and tribute into something that could be counted, controlled, and transformed into power. They rose above plains and valleys like hardened knots in the landscape, commanding roads, fields, and coastlines, and they cultivated the feeling that the world beneath them had an order that would endure as long as the palace endured. This was not a world of scattered villages loosely connected by tradition, but a world in which authority concentrated itself into centers that pulled resources inward and pushed commands outward, as if the countryside existed mainly to be organized, harvested, and made useful to the needs of an elite. A palace was not simply a residence, but an administrative machine, a place where scribes, overseers, and officials translated living communities into lists of obligations, lists of rations, lists of workers, lists of animals, lists of goods, and then used those lists to keep society turning in a controlled direction. The evidence of this control survives in the brittle clarity of clay tablets inscribed in Linear B, a writing system whose purpose was rarely story or memory, but the daily management of a complex, centralized economy. These tablets feel almost cold in their practicality, because they preserve not feelings but functions, revealing a world where grain was measured, textiles were tracked, bronze was allocated, weapons were accounted for, and human beings could be reduced to roles that served the palace. Yet the same evidence that shows the system's sophistication also hints at its fragility, because a society that depends on constant coordination, constant flow, and constant compliance can fail quickly when those constants stop being constant. A palace can look strong from the outside and still be dangerously vulnerable inside, because its strength is not only walls but supply, loyalty, and the unbroken rhythm of administration, and rhythms can be disrupted. In the Aegean, several major palatial centers anchored this world, places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and others that functioned as hubs of redistribution and command, each embedded in its own region, but tied into wider patterns of exchange and influence. They relied on skilled craft production, on networks of dependence, and on the ability to mobilize labor and goods at scale, which meant they also relied on stability in the countryside and on routes that remained open across land and sea. Inside these palaces, bronze mattered not only as a practical material but as a strategic one, because bronze shaped the tools that kept agriculture productive and the weapons that allowed authority to enforce itself. To maintain bronze, the palatial world needed copper and tin, and that need tied it into the wider Mediterranean web, meaning that disruption far away could eventually become disruption here, even if the people in a Greek valley could not name the distant origin of their own vulnerability. The palace economy demanded predictability, because redistribution is a promise that must be kept repeatedly if it is to remain believable, and belief is what turns control into legitimacy. When rations arrive on time, when storage is managed, when festivals and obligations proceed as expected, the system feels natural, and the ruling class can mistake that natural feeling for something guaranteed. But guarantee is an illusion in any human system, and in this period the illusions of the Aegean palaces were beginning to thin under pressures that did not always look dramatic while they unfolded. Shorter harvests strain the countryside, strained countryside resents extraction, resentment weakens compliance, weakened compliance disrupts production, disrupted production reduces surplus, reduced surplus forces harsher demands, and harsher demands sharpen anger, turning a functioning mechanism into a tightening spiral. In such a spiral, even small shocks can become decisive, because the system has already spent the margin that would normally absorb pain. A failed shipment, a local revolt, a raid along a road, a breakdown in trust between center and periphery, any of these can begin to matter far more than they would have mattered in a healthier time, because weakness magnifies everything that touches it. Then the fires come. Not one fire, but many, scattered across the palatial landscape like sudden wounds opening in the fabric of the world, because when collapse spreads, it rarely follows a single neat line. A palace is uniquely vulnerable to fire because palaces store wealth, and stored wealth is fuel, oil sealed in jars, timber beams holding roofs, textiles stacked and bundled, workshops full of charcoal and kindling, and concentrated spaces where one uncontrolled flame can become a storm. When a palace burns, it is not only architecture that is destroyed, but the machinery of coordination, the records, the storerooms, the tools of redistribution, the symbolic heart that told the countryside where authority lived. At sites such as Pylos, the Linear B tablets themselves survived largely because disaster turned them into accidental fossils, with fire hardening the clay that was never intended to last, preserving administrative snapshots at the moment the system that produced them was dying. This is one of the cruel ironies of collapse, that destruction can preserve evidence even as it erases the living meaning of what was written, because a ration list without a functioning palace is not a tool, but a relic. What makes the Mycenaean collapse especially haunting is not only that palaces burned, because cities have always burned, but that the palatial order did not simply rebuild itself in the old form afterward. Rebuilding requires surplus, because laborers must be fed while they rebuild, requires stable authority, because rebuilding must be protected from immediate renewed destruction, and requires confidence that the effort will be rewarded by a future that resembles the past. When those requirements fail, ruins become a kind of permanent punctuation, an abrupt stop in the old sentence of history. A burned complex can be scavenged, stones reused, metal pried from ash, timber salvaged if any remains, yet scavenging is not restoration, because scavenging treats the palace as a carcass rather than as a heart. As the palaces fall, the administrative literacy tied to them falls too, because Linear B was not a general writing culture spread broadly through society, but a specialized tool used by palace scribes for palace needs. When the palatial system collapses, the social niche that required and sustained those scribes collapses with it, and a writing system that existed primarily to serve administration can disappear rapidly when administration itself becomes impossible. This disappearance is not a gentle fading, but a sudden quiet in the record, like a lamp extinguished in a room that had never contained many lamps to begin with. One day there are tablets, lists, inventories, controlled distribution, and the sense of a world made legible to elites, and then there is silence, not because people stopped speaking, but because the institutions that recorded their speaking stopped existing. The loss of writing is not merely a cultural detail, it is a symptom of a deeper systemic change, because writing in this context was the nervous system of palatial power. Without it, large-scale coordination becomes harder, taxation becomes less precise, redistribution becomes less reliable, and authority becomes more local, more personal, more dependent on direct relationships rather than on bureaucratic reach. The landscape that follows is not empty, but altered. People remain, fields remain, villages remain, yet the pattern changes from centralized nodes to smaller, more autonomous communities that must rely on their own resilience rather than on palatial guarantees. This shift is sometimes described as a descent into a dark age, yet darkness here does not mean an absence of life, but an absence of the kind of documentation and monumental certainty that palaces produced. It is a darkness of records, a thinning of long-distance complexity, a retreat from the tight administrative web that once linked the Aegean into a broader system. When the palaces vanish, so does a certain kind of elite world, the world of centralized feasting, of controlled craft production, of chariot status and hierarchical display that required steady supplies and coordinated labor. Chariot warfare, for example, is expensive not only in horses and vehicles but in the entire infrastructure that supports horses, vehicles, trained crews, and the metal fittings that keep the machine functioning, and in expensive military-style struggles to survive when trade and surplus falter. As the old elite structure breaks, power does not disappear, it changes shape, becoming more fragmented and more dependent on immediate control of land, labor, and followers. In such a world, the grand palatial center is less useful than a defensible hill, a loyal kin group, a store of food, and a reputation for force, because survival logic favors what can be guarded directly. The sea, once a corridor of exchange, becomes more ambiguous, because when large-scale trade contracts, the same waters that carried copper and oil can carry raiders, migrants, and fear. Coastal settlements become cautious, inland communities become wary of outsiders, and the social trust required for long-range exchange weakens, which further reduces exchange, creating a loop where insecurity feeds contraction and contraction feeds insecurity. The end of Linear B is therefore not just an end of script, but a marker of a world becoming less centralized, less bureaucratic, and less able to sustain the fine-grained control that palaces demanded. When writing disappears, memory shifts from clay to voice, from list to story, and story changes with each telling, which means that even the recent past can become unstable, like smoke that cannot be grasped. The centuries that follow are not silent in human terms, because people still sing, mourn, trade when they can, fight when they must, love, fear, and raise children under altered skies. But they are quieter in institutional terms, because the old centers that created archives, monumental programs, and administrative continuity have fallen, leaving fewer structures capable of projecting their voice across time. Settlements often become smaller, more defensible, or more mobile, depending on local conditions, because safety becomes a primary architectural principle when the wider order is uncertain. A lowland palace complex, once confident in its walls and its authority, can be less attractive than a high place that can be watched and defended with fewer men, because fewer men are available, and fewer men can be spared for anything that is not immediate survival. Craft production changes too, because specialized workshops tied to palatial demand shrink or vanish when palatial demand vanishes. A potter still makes pots, a smith still works metal when metal can be found, but the scale becomes different, the distribution more local, the reach less wide, and the sense of an integrated economy becomes faint. The loss is also emotional, even if it is not recorded, because a palace is a promise, a place that tells people the world has a center, and when that center burns and does not return, the world feels more uncertain, more exposed. A person who watched a palace burn, or who heard of it, learns a lesson that cannot easily be forgotten, that walls can fail, that elites can flee, that the gods do not always intervene, and that continuity is something that can break. Over time, new forms of stability will emerge, but the path is long, and for generations the Aegean exists in a state that is simpler and harsher, with fewer long-distance guarantees and more local risk. Writing, which had served the palaces, does not immediately return, because writing is not only an invention, it is an institution, and institutions require surplus, specialized training, and a reason to maintain them. Much later, a different script will appear in Greek lands, adapted from outside influences, and reshaped into something new, and this later writing will serve different social needs than linear B ever did. But between the palatial tablets and the later alphabetic world lies a wide stretch of time, measured not in a handful of years but in centuries, during which memory must travel by voice alone, carried through fragile human chains that break easily. The image that remains is therefore not only of palaces burning, but of a society's administrative voice being extinguished, leaving behind ruins where lists once ruled, leaving behind landscapes where the old centers no longer coordinate the flow of grain, metal, and labor, and leaving behind people who must rebuild their lives without the invisible scaffolding that bureaucracy once provided. It is a silence made from ash, from broken seals, from storerooms emptied by flame and scavenging, from roads that feel less safe, from workshops that no longer receive steady inputs, and from the sudden absence of a script that had turned everyday life into control. Egypt does not fall in the same way the coastal kingdoms fall, because the Nile is not merely a river, but a system of predictable renewal that can cushion scarcity longer than most lands, and because Egypt's state tradition is old enough to behave like stone, absorbing shocks that would shatter younger political forms. Yet survival is not the same as remaining unchanged, and the most unsettling truth of this period is that a kingdom can endure while still being permanently altered, the way a body can live after a wound that never fully heals. The Nile's rhythm offers a kind of protection, because flood and silt can still promise harvest even when broader patterns of climate and trade have begun to fail elsewhere, and this promise gives the Egyptian state more time, more margin, more moments to adjust before panic becomes irreversible. But the Nile is not a wall, and geography is not invincibility, because an interconnected world can deliver collapse as pressure rather than conquest, as shortage rather than siege, as the thinning of a wider system that Egypt once relied upon without needing to name the reliance. Egypt had long lived as both participant and observer within the eastern Mediterranean web, trading, negotiating, fighting when necessary, and projecting a confidence rooted in its antiquity. Yet even antiquity must eat, must arm itself, must pay workers, and must maintain order in crowded cities where hunger can spread faster than decrees. When external hubs burn and foreign routes become unsafe, the flow of goods changes, and Egypt feels those changes in the most practical ways, in shortages of imported materials, in rising costs, in the strain of managing border security, and in the unpredictable arrival of people who are not merchants but refugees or raiders. The threat that approaches Egypt in this era does not arrive as a single clean army with a single banner, because the wider region is already in motion, and motion delivers mixed human currents, some armed, some starving, some organized, some shattered, all of them dangerous in different ways. The sea that once carried gifts and timber and copper can now carry uncertainty, and uncertainty demands a response that is as much psychological as military, because fear can destabilize a state even when walls still stand. Egypt's records, carved into stone and painted into monumental spaces, speak of foreigners, of battles, of repelled invasions, and the language of these records is never neutral, because royal inscriptions are written to create reality as much as to describe it. A pharaoh does not simply report that he fought and won, he declares that cosmic order has been restored through his strength, because in Egypt the ruler is not only a political leader, but a guarantor of balance, and balance must be performed when it is threatened. This is why propaganda becomes louder in this moment. The louder the stone insists on victory and stability, the more we can sense the anxiety underneath, because a truly unchallenged order does not need to convince itself with such intensity, and a truly secure state does not need to carve reassurance into every surface like a protective spell. In the broad span of the 12th century before the Common Era, Egypt faces the kind of pressure that tests not only armies but institutions, because defending borders is one challenge, while maintaining internal distribution, labor discipline, and public confidence at the same time is another, and it is the overlap of these challenges that turns survival into strain. If soldiers must be mobilized, they must be fed, and feeding soldiers draws from the same grain base that feeds workers, priests, and cities, and when any part of that base is stressed, every additional demand feels sharper. There is a particular kind of danger in defending against a threat that may include families as well as fighters, because a family column implies not a raid that ends with departure, but a movement that seeks settlement, and settlement is harder to repel than plunder. A raider wants wealth and can be bought off, frightened away, or defeated, but a desperate population wants land and food are not things a state can easily hand over without weakening itself. The Egyptian state responds with force, with organization, with the disciplined violence of a long-established military machine, and in some depictions the enemy is shown trapped between land defenses and naval tactics, caught in a geometry designed to turn movement into defeat. But even a successful defense can be expensive, and expense is a hidden wound, because it drains reserves, it demands more from labor, and it pushes the state toward tighter control at the moment when people most desire relief. Defense also creates captives. Captives can be turned into laborers, garrison settlers, or controlled populations within the state, and this solution can strengthen short-term capacity, while changing the social fabric in ways that produce long-term tension, because forcibly integrated groups do not simply dissolve into harmony by decree. A state that survives by absorbing displaced people survives in a new form, with new internal pressures, new identities, and new fault lines that must be managed for generations. Egypt's survival is therefore not an untouched continuity, but a managed transformation. The state becomes more defensive, more strained, more focused on stability as control rather than stability as abundance, and this shift alters the feeling of life even if the temples still stand and the rituals still proceed. Within the cities and work settlements, the stress can be felt in practical disruptions, in delayed rations, in anxiety among laborers, in the growing sense that officials are squeezing harder, and that the world outside the valley is no longer a reliable source of calm. When people are anxious, small administrative failures become large political problems, because legitimacy depends on the daily proof that the state can still provide, still coordinate, still protect. Even when harvest remains relatively strong in parts of Egypt, the state's obligations expand. It must defend frontiers. It must maintain garrisons. It must feed workers. It must sustain temple economies. And it must manage the symbolic role of the pharaoh as guarantor of order, which means it must continuously assert that order is not slipping. Symbolic assertion matters because panic is contagious. If people believe the gods have withdrawn favor, then obedience weakens, and if obedience weakens, officials become harsher, and harsher officials deepen resentment, and resentment feeds disorder, creating the very instability the state is trying to prevent. So the state speaks loudly, carves loudly, stages victory loudly, because silence would allow fear to fill the space. Yet the stone voice cannot fully hide the changes in the wider landscape. Foreign cities that once served as trading partners have burned or weakened. Routes that once carried timber, copper, and luxury goods have become risky. Diplomatic relationships that once felt stable have fractured. And the wider balance that allowed Egypt to project influence outward becomes harder to maintain when the outside world itself is fragmenting. An empire can be strongest when it has neighbors strong enough to trade with and weak enough to dominate. Yet the collapse of neighbors creates a different challenge, because it replaces predictable rivals with unpredictable voids. A void attracts raiders, migrants, and local warlords, and a frontier facing a void must be watched constantly, because instability has no schedule and cannot be deterred by treaties that require functioning states to honor them. Egypt's internal politics also shift under such conditions, because stress intensifies competition within the elite. When resources thin, factions sharpen. When prestige is threatened, priesthoods and administrators protect their own interests more aggressively. And when the state must spend more on defense, it may have less to spend on the everyday generosity that keeps the social contract from feeling like pure extraction. The temple system, deeply intertwined with economy, becomes even more central because temples hold grain, hold labor, hold land, and hold the religious authority that interprets crisis as meaning rather than randomness. But the greater the temple's economic weight, the greater the political tension that can grow between priestly power and royal power, especially when the wider world makes the royal image harder to sustain without constant reinforcement. For ordinary Egyptians, the change can feel like a tightening of life rather than an immediate catastrophe. Markets still exist, yet prices can rise. Festivals still occur, yet the mood can be heavier. Work continues, yet rations can be delayed. And people become more aware of security, of borders, of the sense that threats may come not only from rival kings, but from movements of desperate people driven by hunger and collapse elsewhere. This is the difference between being destroyed and being strained. Egypt does not vanish, but it must spend more energy to remain itself, and spending energy is exhausting, because it consumes the surplus that allows a civilization to feel confident rather than merely alive. A civilization that uses its surplus to defend its boundaries has less surplus to build, to innovate, to stabilize internal inequalities, and so its future becomes narrower. The royal narrative of triumph therefore coexists with a quieter reality of pressure. Stone can declare victory, yet victory does not automatically restore the old world of stable trade, stable diplomacy, and predictable borders, because the wider collapse has altered the conditions that once made Egyptian strength feel effortless. A victory in battle can prevent immediate conquest, yet it cannot resurrect the burned cities across the sea, cannot reopen every route, cannot rebuild the great hubs that once anchored the international system. So Egypt survives in a landscape where survival itself becomes an achievement. It survives with a heightened sense of threat. It survives with greater internal strain. It survives with a louder ideological insistence on order. And it survives while gradually changing into something more defensive, more fractured in its power balances, and more conscious that the world beyond the Nile Valley is no longer a familiar stage where old scripts can be performed reliably. The Nile continues to rise and fall, offering the appearance of cosmic continuity, and that appearance is one of the reasons Egypt can endure longer than many others, because people can still look at the river and believe in return. Yet return is not the same as restoration, and the river's faithful cycle cannot fully protect a state from the consequences of a shattered international world, where insecurity travels across water and land, where displaced peoples reshape borders, and where the old balance that once made the Bronze Age feel permanent has already been broken. In this altered survival, there is a quiet sadness, because endurance comes with cost, and cost is often paid in the narrowing of possibilities. When a state must focus on holding rather than expanding, on defending rather than flourishing, it becomes heavier, more suspicious, more controlled, and even those who remain fed can feel the weight in the atmosphere of daily life. Survival remains, but the world is no longer the same world, and the very fact that Egypt can still speak in stone makes the change more poignant, because the voice continues while the environment around it grows darker and more uncertain. Writing is often treated like a permanent human invention, as if once marks have been taught to hold meaning, they will keep holding meaning forever. Yet in reality, writing is one of the most fragile achievements a society can possess because it does not survive on brilliance alone, but on surplus, on training, on stable institutions, and on the quiet confidence that tomorrow will still be structured enough to care about records. A script is not merely a set of signs, but a living ecosystem of schools, ration allotments, archive rooms, seals, courier routes, and officials whose authority depends on documentation. And when that ecosystem is starved by famine, broken by war, or scattered by migration, the marks do not slowly fade into obscurity, so much as they abruptly lose their place in the world. In the palatial Bronze Age, writing served power long before it served personal memory, because the tablet and the seal were tools designed to make human life legible, countable, and therefore governable, turning harvest into inventory, labor into schedules, debts into obligations, and entire communities into manageable lines pressed into clay by hands trained to think like the state. The scribe in such a system is not an artist but a specialist whose skill exists because the palace exists, and the palace exists because it can pull surplus inward, store it, redistribute it, and enforce compliance, which means the scribe's inkless world of clay is held up by the same pillars that are now beginning to crack. When those pillars fracture, the first thing that changes is not the ability of people to speak or remember, but the ability of institutions to keep producing the steady administrative heartbeat that writing makes visible, because a functioning bureaucracy cannot help leaving traces, and a broken one cannot help falling silent. In a healthy palace economy, tablets multiply endlessly, not because anyone seeks immortality, but because daily control demands constant documentation, and once control fails, once grain does not arrive, once rations cannot be trusted, once workers refuse labor, once guards become unreliable, once the road becomes dangerous, there is suddenly no stable reason to keep recording life as if life still obeyed the old system. There is a cruel irony in the way destruction sometimes preserves what ordinary functioning never intended to preserve, because fire hardens clay and turns temporary records into permanent artifacts, so that a ration list survives precisely because the storeroom burned and the administrative world that produced the list died in the same heat that sealed it. Yet preservation of tablets is not preservation of meaning, because a record is a tool only when the system that enforces it still breathes, and once the palace is empty or ruined, a perfectly legible inventory becomes a fossil, a treaty becomes a souvenir, and a schedule becomes a joke told by ash. Writing also depends on a social niche, a protected place in the structure where a person can spend years learning signs instead of plowing fields or guarding gates, and that niche exists only when a society has enough margin to feed specialists, enough order to make expertise valuable, and enough stability to ensure that knowledge will still be rewarded next season. When collapse squeezes the margin out of life, the scribe becomes simply another mouth to feed and another body that must be defended, and the skill of keeping accounts becomes less immediately valuable than the skill of finding water, repairing tools, planting quickly, moving quietly, and surviving a road that no longer feels safe. As a result, the disappearance of writing across parts of the Eastern Mediterranean is not a mysterious cultural amnesia, so much as an economic and institutional suffocation, because when palaces and administrative centers vanish, the trained hands vanish with them, the archive rooms become empty shells, and the habit of recording reality is replaced by the harder habit of enduring reality. In some places, temples can preserve islands of literacy a little longer, because ritual continuity can outlast political continuity, yet even sacred institutions depend on offerings, on labor, on protection, and on the calm routine that allows specialists to exist, and when fear and scarcity become constant, the sacred niche shrinks too. The practical consequences of this silence arrive long before anyone could describe them as an end of memory, because without documents, large-scale taxation becomes clumsier, redistribution becomes less reliable, and long-distance coordination becomes harder, since coordination across distance requires records that can be consulted, verified, and enforced beyond the fragility of human recollection. A border agreement that once existed as a sealed tablet now exists as a contested story. A debt that once could be proven now becomes an argument, and an obligation that once had administrative weight becomes negotiable, not because people have become morally different, but because proof has become scarce and scarcity changes how disputes are settled. In a world where documents no longer anchor legitimacy, authority becomes more local and more personal, because a distant decree matters only if the road is safe, the messenger arrives, and the sender still has the power to punish refusal. And when those conditions fail, power flows toward whoever can be seen, trusted, feared, or followed directly. This shift does not necessarily make life simpler in a comforting way, because personal authority can be flexible, but it can also be brutal, and when communities are under pressure, they often decide conflict not through paperwork, but through kinship, reputation, and force, since force is the one argument that does not require an archive to be convincing. The deeper change is what happens to memory itself, because writing preserves exactness, preserving not only names and titles but quantities, boundaries, schedules, and the unglamorous daily scaffolding of governance. And when writing disappears, memory must travel again through voice, through repetition, through the human chain of telling that bends under fear, pride, grief, and the simple erosion of time. Oral tradition can be powerful, yet it preserves differently than writing does, tending to keep what can be carried emotionally, warnings, genealogies, heroic tales, laments, while letting the routine mechanics of administration vanish, which means the world loses not the past itself, but the kind of past that is measurable and verifiable. This is why the silence is so unsettling, because it is not merely the loss of texts, but the loss of a civilization's ability to speak to itself across distance and across time in a consistent voice. And once that voice is gone, the past becomes easier to reshape, easier to claim, easier to weaponize, since whoever controls the story can justify the present without needing documents to prove it. Names that were once fixed in clay become vulnerable to dispute, lineages that were once recorded become matters of assertion, and borders that once had treaty weight become fluid, because when institutions fade, the map of certainty contracts into what can be remembered, defended, and enforced locally. The image that remains is not just of burned buildings, but of archive rooms turned into mausoleums, where shelves hold stacks of clay that no longer command anything, where seals lie unused like dead insects, and where the very architecture that once existed to preserve continuity becomes a container for absence. A person who once lived under a system of tablets and quotas would feel this absence not as an academic fact, but as a change in the atmosphere of life, because when the officials stop arriving, when the lists stop being read, and when obligations stop being enforced in the old way, the world feels less coordinated, less predictable, and more exposed, as if the invisible scaffolding that held society upright has been removed overnight. Even so, the human voice continues, because people still speak and sing and mourn and warn their children, and these voices carry fragments forward, yet the fragments are different from the old administrative record, preserving the feeling of crisis more readily than the exact mechanisms of power that once managed it. So the end of writing becomes, in a profound sense, the end of a particular kind of memory, the memory of exactness and the memory of bureaucracy, leaving behind a world where history becomes rumor more easily, where the past becomes smoke that cannot be grasped, and where survival depends less on what is written and more on what can be carried in the body, the household, and the immediate community. After the palaces fall and the archives stop speaking, the world does not end, because the world rarely ends for those living inside it, yet it becomes quieter in a way that feels like a physical change in the air, as if the noise of coordination, the certainty of routes, and the steady pressure of administration have been replaced by something more local, more suspicious, and more exposed. What disappears is not humanity, but density of organization, the kind of complexity that requires stable surplus and predictable exchange. And when that complexity collapses, life contracts toward what can be protected, what can be grown, what can be carried, and what can be defended without needing a distant center to guarantee the rules. The people who remain do not step into a neatly defined new era, because eras are names applied later by minds that can see the whole shape of time, while the living experience is simply a continuing present, made harder by the loss of familiar supports. A family wakes up and still needs water, still needs food, still needs shelter from wind and rain, and the absence of a palace does not change these requirements. It only changes the environment in which they must be met, because now the old pipelines of redistribution are unreliable or gone, the old roads are riskier, and the old assumptions about protection no longer feel credible. In many places, settlements become smaller or more defensible, not as an ideological choice, but as a practical response to insecurity, because a small community can move more easily, can hide more easily, and can defend itself with fewer people, while a large exposed town becomes a tempting target in a world where raiding has become an ordinary form of acquisition. Where once the landscape was anchored by major administrative centers that drew people inward and concentrated resources behind walls, now the same landscape is dotted with communities that prefer distance from roads, distance from coastlines, and distance from the kinds of visibility that once meant trade, but now can mean threat. The contraction is visible in the flow of goods, because long-distance exchange becomes less frequent and more dangerous, not necessarily disappearing entirely, but losing the regularity that makes it feel like a system rather than a series of risky opportunities. A merchant may still travel, but he travels with more caution, with fewer guarantees, and with the awareness that every journey depends not on treaties and stable police power, but on luck, local politics, and the fragile willingness of strangers not to kill him for his cargo. When trade contracts, specialization contracts with it, because specialization is a luxury that requires reliable exchange to supply inputs and distribute outputs, and in a harsher world, many communities cannot afford to support people who do only one thing. Craft production continues, yet it shifts toward what can be done locally, with locally available materials, and with tools that can be repaired without requiring imported components. The beautiful fine-grained palatial economies that once coordinated textiles, metals, and skilled labor at scale become faint, replaced by more modest, more pragmatic rhythms. Metal becomes different. Bronze, dependent on distant tin and established routes, becomes harder to maintain in large quantities, and scarcity pushes communities toward reuse, salvage, and careful repair, because a broken blade cannot be easily replaced when the network that once supplied it has collapsed. Old weapons and tools are hoarded, reworked, and passed down, and scavenging becomes a regular practice, because ruins are not only symbols of loss, but sources of material in a world where new material is harder to obtain. In such a landscape, ruins become part of everyday geography. A burned palace becomes a place where people pull out stones for new walls, where they search for metal fragments, where they avoid certain rooms because the air still carries a stale smell of ash after rain, and where stories gather, because any ruin large enough to defy nature's quick reclamation becomes a magnet for memory and fear. Children grow up seeing these hulks and hearing older voices speak about how the world used to feel, and the gap between the present and those remembered descriptions becomes a quiet form of grief. Population does not vanish everywhere, yet movement becomes more common, because when central authority weakens, people are less bound to place by administrative obligation and more bound by survival logic, which can demand relocation. Some move toward more defensible terrain, some toward river valleys that still promise harvest, some toward coastal zones that still offer fish and opportunistic trade, and some simply keep moving because stability has become too fragile to risk investing in a single spot. Migration changes social relations. A village receiving newcomers must decide whether to absorb them, exploit them, or drive them away, and each decision carries consequences, because in a world of scarcity, generosity is dangerous and cruelty can invite retaliation. New alliances form through marriage, through shared defense, through mutual labor, and these alliances are often more personal than the old diplomatic world, because the institutions that once formalized relationships are gone, leaving human bonds as the primary glue. Authority becomes fragmented and intimate. Instead of a distant king whose power is expressed through seals and scribes, leadership shifts toward those who can provide immediate security, distribute food, organize defense, and maintain cohesion, and such leadership is often contested, because the mechanisms of legitimacy have become weaker. A strongman's authority can be based on reputation and force, but reputation must be constantly maintained, and force must be constantly fed, meaning that politics becomes more volatile, more reactive, and more prone to sudden shifts. The absence of writing in many regions deepens this volatility because agreements and claims depend more on memory and witness, and memory can be shaped, and witness can be bought, threatened, or killed. The past becomes something people argue about, not in scholarly terms but in practical ones, because if you can claim a field belonged to your ancestors, you can justify taking it, and if no document exists to prove otherwise, the argument can end in violence. This does not mean life becomes nothing but brutality, but it means that the quiet administrative certainty that once prevented many disputes from escalating is no longer there as a stabilizing pressure. The rhythm of religion changes as well. Some temples remain active, some are abandoned, some are replaced by smaller shrines, and the relationship to the divine becomes more local, because the grand state rituals that once reinforced imperial ideology require resources and centralized coordination that are now harder to sustain. People still pray, still offer, still seek meaning, yet the gods are approached with a different tone, more intimate, more anxious, and often more focused on immediate protection than on cosmic order, because the experience of the world has become less orderly. There is also a change in the way time is felt. In a palatial world, time can feel structured by calendars, quotas, festivals, and predictable flows of goods, while in a fragmented world time can feel more seasonal and more uncertain, shaped by weather, by threat, by the availability of labor, and by the need to respond quickly to rumor. Years become harder to distinguish from one another when fewer institutions are recording them, and memory becomes less about dates and more about events: the year of the fire, the year of the famine, the year the raiders came, the year the village moved. The long dark after is therefore dark not because nothing happens, but because fewer voices remain that can project their story across centuries, leaving later generations with gaps where once there were archives. It is a darkness of record and of long-distance clarity, a thinning of the kind of evidence that makes a past feel solid, while the lived reality in that past may have been intensely vivid, full of struggle, adaptation, and new forms of community. In some areas, violence becomes more common as a background threat, because the collapse of large states removes certain restraints, and because raiding is an effective strategy when trade is reduced, and when a community can gain resources faster by taking than by producing. Yet even raiding follows patterns, and communities learn to adapt, building in defensible positions, forming watch systems, storing supplies in ways that can be hidden, and creating alliances that can be called upon quickly, because survival becomes a practice rather than a single crisis. The greatest transformation may be psychological. A person living under palace order, even if exploited by it, could still imagine a world with a center, a world where authority had recognizable rituals, and where disruption was expected to be temporary. In the long dark after, the expectation of restoration weakens, and people begin to accept instability as normal, shaping their lives around caution, redundancy, and the assumption that help may not arrive from anywhere beyond the community itself. Children born into this period inherit a different normal, because they do not remember the palace's functioning, do not remember officials with tablets, do not remember regular shipments from faraway ports, and so the old world becomes, for them, a story told by elders, a story that can feel almost mythical, because it describes a scale of organization that no longer matches what they see each day. The elders' memories become haunting, because they insist that the world used to be larger, richer, more connected, and the insistence can sound like both nostalgia and warning, as if the past itself is a ghost lingering over the present. Over decades and centuries, communities adjust to this new reality, but adjustment is not comfort, because it often means accepting a harsher life as ordinary, accepting fewer luxuries, fewer guarantees, and fewer chances to rely on distant networks. The world becomes more local, and local life can be resilient and meaningful, yet it also means that a drought, a raid, or a feud can have larger consequences because there are fewer external supports to cushion the blow. This is what makes the long dark after feel so profound, because it is not a single catastrophe, but a prolonged thinning of complexity, a long season in which the old structures remain as ruins, the old networks remain as memory, and the daily labor of survival takes place under the shadow of a world that once believed it was permanent. The night is not empty, but it is quieter, and in that quiet the echoes of the Bronze Age are still there, faint and unsettling, like distant thunder heard long after the storm has passed, reminding those who live in the aftermath that the world they inhabit is built on fragments of something that broke. A collapse is never only an ending, because endings leave behind materials, habits, fears, and fragments of knowledge that do not vanish simply because the palaces are gone, and over time those fragments begin to settle into new patterns, not as a triumphant rebirth, but as a slow, practical rearrangement driven by the simplest demand of history, which is that people must keep living. The world that forms after the Great Bronze Age network breaks is not a clean replacement, and it is not progress in a straight line because it carries scars, it carries gaps, and it carries a deep memory of vulnerability that shapes how communities build, trade, worship, and defend themselves. The first thing to understand is that adaptation does not feel like renaissance to those doing it, because adaptation is often exhaustion with a new routine, the daily work of making a harsher environment survivable, of learning which old expectations must be abandoned, and of discovering which old techniques still function when the institutions that once supported them have vanished. In this landscape, innovation is rarely a celebration of novelty, but a response to constraint, because constraints force experimentation the way pressure forces water into new channels. Metal changes the feeling of possibility. Bronze does not disappear, but it becomes less reliably available on a large scale in many regions, because bronze depends on long-distance access to tin and to the stable routes that carry it, and when those routes remain uncertain, a society that wants tools and weapons must become more flexible in what it can use. Iron, present in many places more widely than tin, and capable of being worked once techniques spread and improve, begins to matter more, not because it is instantly superior in every way, but because it offers a different kind of supply logic, a material that can be found closer to home, and therefore feels less hostage to distant political storms. The emergence of iron is not a sudden revolution with a single date, because technological shifts rarely unfold like proclamations, but as uneven adoption across regions, driven by who can access or who can develop workable methods, and who can afford the labor and fuel required to smelt and refine. Some communities continue to value bronze for specific uses, some combine metals, some salvage older blades and fittings, and some begin to experiment with iron in ways that are at first crude, and then gradually more reliable, as knowledge spreads through craftsmen, through trade, and through the movement of people who carry skills as part of their survival baggage. With metal shifts come shifts in warfare and authority. The palatial military styles that depended on expensive infrastructure, trained chariot teams, concentrated armories, and highly organized supply become harder to sustain in many areas, and when a form of warfare becomes too costly, power begins to favor what can be maintained locally, what can be mobilized quickly, and what does not require an entire bureaucratic machine to keep functioning. This does not mean violence disappears, but it changes texture, becoming more tied to local raiding, to border skirmishes, to personal retinues, and to the rough calculus of defense, because a fragmented world produces fragmented conflict. Political forms shift in the same way, not toward perfection, but toward what fits the new environment. Where once authority could be projected through seals, archives, and the prestige of palatial centers, now authority depends more on visible leadership, on kin networks, on the ability to provide food in hard seasons, and on the ability to protect against raids, because legitimacy becomes less about inherited ceremony and more about practical success. Small kingdoms, chiefdoms, and localized power clusters begin to fill the spaces left by fallen empires, and these new entities are often more flexible than the old states, yet also more unstable, because their cohesion depends on personalities and immediate outcomes rather than on long-established institutions. Trade begins to return, but it returns differently. The old international system with its formal gift exchange between great kings and its steady corridors of bulk material movement is no longer the default, and in its place emerges a more opportunistic and regionally focused exchange, sometimes coastal, sometimes river-based, sometimes built on networks of smaller ports rather than on a few dominant hubs. Merchants who travel now may rely less on treaties and more on personal relationships, less on imperial guarantees and more on negotiated protection, because the world has learned that guarantees written by distant powers can vanish overnight. When exchange becomes more localized, craftsmanship becomes more locally adapted as well. Specialized production does not disappear, but it becomes reorganized, shaped by what materials can be secured and by what customers exist, and this can produce a different aesthetic, a different emphasis, because a society that has lost palatial elites will not produce the same categories of prestige objects in the same quantities. Luxury changes its meaning, sometimes becoming smaller, more portable, and more focused on personal display rather than on massive administrative grandeur, because portability matters in a world where stability can never be assumed. Religious life also changes, not necessarily by abandoning old gods, but by shifting how gods are approached and where worship is centered. Some major sanctuaries persist or re-emerge, yet many communities rely more heavily on local shrines, household rituals, and practices that do not require a palace-temple complex to organize, because the spiritual need remains even when the institutional apparatus shrinks. In such conditions, religion can become more intimate, more tied to protection, fertility, and immediate survival, and less tied to the grand ideological maintenance of empire, because empire is no longer the framework shaping daily life for many people. Over time, new cultural forms begin to crystallize, and one of the most significant is the gradual reappearance of writing in different shapes and with different purposes. When writing returns in parts of the Mediterranean world, it is not simply the old palatial scripts resurrected, because the old palatial scripts were tied to the old palatial administrative needs, and those needs have changed, so the tools that serve them change as well. A new script can spread because it is easier to learn, because it serves broader communication beyond palace accounting, and because communities rebuilding exchange and identity find value in being able to record agreements, names, offerings, and stories with a more flexible system than the old bureaucratic frameworks allowed. This slow reformation of writing is part of a larger shift in how memory is held. Oral tradition has carried the collapse through generations, turning the burning of palaces, the movement of peoples, and the experience of hunger into stories that warn and explain, and when writing reappears, it begins to interact with these oral memories, sometimes fixing them, sometimes reshaping them, sometimes giving prestige to certain versions of the past. The past becomes a resource, not only emotionally but politically, because in a new world, claims to land, lineage, and legitimacy can be strengthened by controlling the story of what came before. Settlement patterns also slowly adjust toward greater stability in many areas, though stability does not mean returning to the old palatial scale. Communities rebuild, fields are cleared again, terraces repaired, roads reused, and coastlines reoccupied in places where risk becomes manageable, yet the memory of vulnerability remains embedded in choices. So many settlements favor defensibility and redundancy, favoring locations that can be watched, protected, and supplied without relying on a single fragile route. The new world therefore forms in layers. First comes survival. Then comes adaptation. Then comes the gradual accumulation of surplus again, which allows specialization to return, allows broader exchange to strengthen, and allows institutions to become more durable. As surplus grows, new elites emerge, yet these elites grow in a landscape shaped by the memory of collapse, and that memory can make them more defensive, more pragmatic, and more attentive to the dangers of overdependence on single points of failure. It is important to resist the temptation to narrate this as inevitable improvement, because what forms is not automatically better for everyone, and new hierarchies can be as harsh as old ones, even if they were different symbols. What has changed is the shape of dependence, because the old Late Bronze Age world depended on a tightly connected international system whose disruption could cascade catastrophically, while the emerging world often relies on a more fragmented set of connections that can fail locally without necessarily bringing everything down at once. This fragmentation can be a weakness because it reduces large-scale coordination, yet it can also be a kind of resilience because it prevents single collapses from spreading as widely, and it encourages communities to build redundancy into their survival strategies. A world with fewer gigantic nodes may be less dazzling, yet it can be harder to topple completely, because its power is distributed rather than centralized, and distributed systems can absorb shocks differently. Still, the cost of this new world is visible in what has been lost. The grand palaces, the international diplomacy of great kings, the high administrative complexity, the vast archives, the confidence of continuity, all of these have faded, leaving behind a simpler, tougher environment where people rebuild with fewer guarantees. And yet the persistence of rebuilding is itself a testimony to human adaptation, because even after decades or centuries of insecurity, people continue to plant, to trade, to marry, to worship, to craft, and to shape meaning out of ruin. What forms is not the old Bronze Age restored, and it is not a sudden leap into the later classical world, but a slow, uneven emergence of new political forms, new material strategies, and new cultural habits, the kind of gradual change that is almost invisible while it happens and only becomes clear when looked at across generations. The echoes of collapse remain, yet new voices begin to fill the spaces between those echoes, building a future that is not a triumph over the past, but a continuation shaped by the past's wounds, proving that even when an age ends in fire and silence, the human world does not stop, it transforms. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the breaking of a world, a silence that is not empty, because it is filled with the aftertaste of smoke, the memory of hunger, the shape of roads that no longer feel safe, and the uneasy awareness that what once seemed permanent was only a pattern held together by many fragile agreements. When people speak about collapse, they often imagine a single dramatic moment, a city falling in a night, a king being overthrown, a decisive battle that ends an era. Yet what lingers most, when you sit close to the evidence and let it breathe, is how collapse is felt as a gradual loss of predictable futures, as the slow evaporation of trust, and as the steady tightening of choices, until the only remaining choices are the ones made under fear. The late Bronze Age world was not a fairy tale, and it was not a machine engineered for comfort, because it demanded taxes, demanded labor, demanded obedience, and demanded that most people carry the weight of systems they did not design. But it still offered something that human beings crave as deeply as food, which is a sense that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it, to invest in it, to raise children with the assumption that the ground beneath them will not suddenly change shape. When that assumption begins to fail, even before the fires, even before the migrations become obvious, a different atmosphere enters daily life, because anxiety is not only a reaction to events, it is the body's recognition that the rules it learned no longer guarantee safety. Imagine what it means to wake in a settlement that still stands, whose walls are still upright, whose fields are still visible, and yet to feel that the world beyond the nearest ridge has become unreliable. The market might still open, but prices might shift in ways that feel unnatural, as if someone has altered the hidden mathematics of scarcity overnight. The temple might still hold rites, but the prayers might sound more urgent, not because people have become more spiritual, but because uncertainty makes the divine feel like the only remaining lever in a world where human levers are slipping. The palace might still issue orders, but the orders might be sharper, more desperate, more repetitive, as if insisting more loudly could compel reality to obey again. It is easy, from the distance of later centuries, to point to causes, to draw lines between climate stress and hunger, between hunger and unrest, between unrest and violence, between violence and the ruin of cities, yet the lived experience would have been less tidy, because people do not experience causes, they experience pressures. A farmer experiences pressure when the harvest is thin, and the collector still arrives with the same demand, because the collector is not collecting grain, he is collecting loyalty, and loyalty is expensive when children are hungry. A sailor experiences pressure when rumors multiply along the coast and familiar routes begin to feel like traps, because the sea is still the sea, indifferent and vast, yet the human presence on its surface has changed, turning the horizon into a place that carries dread as easily as it once carried profit. A potter experiences pressure when the demand for wares shifts and the supply of materials becomes uncertain, because craft is never only craft, it is always embedded in the stability of exchange, and exchange is one of the first things to tremble when trust weakens. There is a temptation to imagine that people in such an age would have seen collapse coming clearly, would have spoken of it openly, would have made neat preparations, yet most human beings cannot live for long in a constant state of apocalyptic expectation, and so they normalize warning signs until the signs become too loud to ignore. A delayed shipment becomes an inconvenience until it becomes a pattern. A failed harvest becomes hardship until it becomes expectation. A bandit on a road becomes rumor until the road itself becomes avoided. And then, without a single clean moment of transition, the world begins to feel smaller, tighter, and more hostile, as if the available space for ordinary life is shrinking. When palatial systems fail, the failure is not only the loss of rulers, but the loss of coordination that once allowed thousands of people to live in a concentrated place without starving. A palace was a storeroom and an office and a ritual center and an armory and a symbol, and when it burned or emptied, it took with it not only wealth, but the invisible scaffolding that made an economy predictable enough to sustain a complex society. In the aftermath, people still organize because humans always organize, yet the scale changes, the reach changes, and the margin for error becomes narrower, because redundancy is one of the luxuries that collapse destroys. The end of writing in many places is one of the most haunting markers of this change, not because people stop thinking, but because the institutions that fed specialists stopped functioning, and without specialists, the ability to preserve exactness dissolves into the softer, more vulnerable substance of oral memory. A world without administrative records can still be rich in story, yet it becomes harder to maintain long-distance obligations, harder to enforce complex redistribution, harder to sustain the kind of bureaucratic stability that once made the late Bronze Age feel like a single connected world rather than a scattering of local struggles. In such a landscape, power becomes closer, more personal, more immediate, and therefore more unpredictable, because a personal authority can be generous one day and violent the next, and there is no archive that guarantees consistency. What remains, when the great structures weaken, is the human body facing practical questions that do not care about grand narratives. Where does food come from when the system that once moved it has failed? Who protects the settlement when the soldiers are gone or unpaid? What happens when refugees arrive, carrying hunger and fear into a place that already has too little of both patience and grain? How do you decide what is just when documents no longer exist, when borders are remembered differently by different mouths, when the past becomes something people argue over because it can no longer be proven? In the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most unsettling truths is that many people likely did not die in dramatic battles, but through slow attrition, through illness that spreads in crowded movement, through malnutrition that weakens immune systems, through violence that flares unpredictably, and through the exhaustion of living in a world where every journey carries risk. Yet the same truth contains another, quieter reality, which is that many people also survived, not by heroism in the romantic sense, but by adaptation, by learning new patterns, by shrinking expectations, by relocating, by forming new alliances, by salvaging old materials, and by accepting that stability would not return quickly. If you stand at the edge of this collapse, not as a scholar, but as a human being imagining the weight of it on the nervous system, you begin to notice how much survival depends on ordinary, almost invisible decisions. Do you store grain quietly rather than display it, knowing that visibility can attract desperate eyes? Do you remain in your village because it holds your ancestors, or do you leave because staying has become a slow death? Do you trust the local strongman who offers protection, knowing that protection can easily become domination? Do you take in newcomers, risking the strain on your own household, or do you refuse them and live with the knowledge that refusal can create enemies who remember? Survival in such a world is not only the possession of strength, but the possession of relationships. A lone household is fragile, yet a network of kin can share labor, share defense, share knowledge of safe routes and hidden water, and these shared resources can mean the difference between enduring and vanishing. At the same time, relationships themselves become strained under scarcity, because scarcity makes generosity dangerous and makes suspicion feel sensible, and when suspicion spreads, communities fracture into smaller circles, each protecting itself, each reducing the willingness to cooperate beyond immediate trust. There is also the question of geography, because in a collapsing world, location becomes destiny more strongly than before. A settlement near dependable water has an advantage, yet it also becomes a target, because others will want that water. A settlement on a trade route can profit when trade returns, yet it also becomes exposed to raiding when insecurity rises. A settlement in defensible terrain can hide, yet it may struggle to farm enough to sustain itself, which means it must balance safety against nourishment. Every advantage contains its own vulnerability, and collapse is often the moment when vulnerabilities outweigh the comforts people once relied upon. When you think about the sea peoples or the raids or the burning layers in cities, it is tempting to imagine that survival depends on facing the threat directly, yet many threats in this era are not single enemies but conditions. A drought cannot be defeated with a spear. A shortage of tin cannot be negotiated away by courage. A breakdown in long-distance trust cannot be repaired by one victory. Conditions require endurance, flexibility, and sometimes the willingness to abandon what you love, and these are forms of strength that do not look like strength until you understand what they cost. There is a quiet cruelty in how collapse teaches people to make choices that leave scars on the soul, because it forces trade-offs between values that, in stable times, could coexist. Compassion and self-preservation become rivals. Honesty becomes dangerous when truth provokes panic. Loyalty becomes complicated when the center demands sacrifice without providing protection. Even the rituals that once offered comfort can become heavy, because a ritual requires surplus, requires offerings, requires time, and time is precious when survival tasks multiply. And yet, humans continue to search for meaning even when the structures of meaning collapse, because meaning is itself a survival strategy, a way to endure uncertainty without losing the will to keep moving. Stories form around ruins. Warnings become traditions. New gods or new interpretations of old gods emerge, not necessarily because people are fickle, but because a shattered world demands explanations that feel adequate to the scale of loss. A burned palace becomes a lesson. An abandoned capital becomes a cautionary symbol. A long season of hunger becomes a memory that shapes how future generations store grain, choose settlements, and judge leaders. If you listen closely, the collapse is not only destruction, but reorganization. Old hierarchies fall, but new hierarchies rise. Old routes fail, but new routes form. Old scripts vanish, but new forms of communication eventually appear. The landscape becomes less centrally controlled, yet it does not become static. It becomes alive with local experiments in survival, some harsh, some cooperative, some brilliant, some brutal. The most unsettling part is that no single person chooses the overall outcome, because collapse is an accumulation of choices made under pressure, interacting with forces no one can command, like climate patterns, disease, and the cascading consequences of trade disruption. A king can issue orders, but he cannot command rain. A palace can store grain, but it cannot store trust once trust has been broken too many times. A wall can hold against a raid, yet it cannot hold against the slow erosion of the social contract that convinces people the wall is worth defending. So the question that remains is not only what happened, but what it would have felt like to live inside it, to be one of the countless unnamed people whose lives were shaped by forces moving far beyond their sight, and to discover slowly that the world you inherited was not guaranteed. Would you have recognized the warning signs early enough to move before movement became dangerous? Would you have had the relationships that could carry you when the old guarantees failed? Would you have been able to adapt your skills to a harsher economy where specialization shrinks and survival favors what can be done locally and repaired endlessly? Would you have been lucky enough to be born in a place with water, with defensibility, with a community that could hold together under stress rather than fracture into suspicion? Would you have been able to endure the psychological weight of uncertainty, the night watching, the rumor listening, the constant calculation of risk, and the quiet grief of seeing familiar structures turn into ruins? In the end, collapse is a mirror held up to human dependence, because it reveals how much of daily life rests on systems we do not always notice until they fail, and it reveals how quickly confidence can become fear when those systems begin to tear. It also reveals how resilient human beings can be, not in the heroic way of legends, but in the stubborn way of continuing, of carrying children forward, of replanting after loss, of rebuilding smaller shelters, of making meaning out of fragments, and of learning to live in a world that no longer promises stability as a birthright. And now, as the echoes of that shattered Bronze Age world fade into the long night of the centuries that followed, keep the question close, not as a game, but as a quiet test of imagination and empathy, because survival in such an era was not an abstract concept. It was a daily negotiation with hunger, fear, community, and chance. Would you have survived in this era?